April 25, 2016 ATB, Shinjuku Ghetto, Tokyo Settlement. 0655. Good work leads to more work. After 3 lives of hard work, that truth had become self-evident. Efficiency was always rewarded with more work, which was frankly understandable since people tended to bet on proven winners. My reward for surviving my watch on the Rhine had been command over a battalion destined for deployment to troubled zones until death or peace came. My reward for claiming Shinjuku was, for better and worse, becoming the authority in Shinjuku. You break it, you buy it, I thought gloomily, nodding my gratitude to Tanaka Chika as she refilled my cup with hot tea. Unlike her elder sister, the young Chika was a fairly happy-go-lucky person, always eager to find new ways to help out around the Rising Sun's meeting hall. It's a pity Ino scooped her up first, I could use an aid or two. Thankfully, I didn't have to handle my newly expanded workload all on my lonesome. Besides Chika, Ino's backroom office was packed with people eagerly waiting for new assignments, courtesy of myself, Naoto, and Ino. Below the murmur of side conversations between the assembled men and women, the rumble of feet and the clink of spoons on bowls drifted from the hall's main room. Breakfast was well underway, and as soon as I distributed assignments to the elected foreman, eager bodies with full bellies would set to work. Eager or not, there's just not enough of them. The thought made me grimace, but it was the truth. Shinjuku Ghetto was home to somewhere around 200,000 men, women, and children, as near as anybody could guess without an official census. By contrast, the Kozuki organization had just over 100 full members, including the students undergoing training at the school. Of course, that number didn't include the Sun Guard, the militia Naoto had assembled from the would-be recruits we couldn't immediately train, nor did it include non-combatants like Chika or Kasumi, Ino's other assistant, who was currently occupied with overseeing the breakfast line. The Sun Guard numbered somewhere around 1,500 but were under-equipped for the most part and entirely untrained. Fortunately, I didn't need an army at the moment. What I needed was a workforce, and the Sun Guard had already been put to good use before during Naoto's Shinjuku improvement project. All right people, Naoto slammed a hand down on Ino's desk, refocusing the room's attention on him. Today's going to be just as busy as yesterday and the day before were, and I'm sure you're all eager to get to work. Before we start handing out assignments, I'd like to thank you and your crews once again. You're doing good work, hard work, and you're doing it quickly and efficiently. We're all pulling together, and I'm honored to have your help. Smiles and nods filled the crowded room, and a few wags in the crowd responded with the typical lame jokes, which received the requisite laughter and a few witty replies from Naoto. It's amazing, I reflected, how easily he wins them over. It's the first thing in the morning, but everybody is lined up happily waiting for their assignments. He'd have made a splendid manager, back in my first life. Back in a sane world. Pulling myself back to the present, I picked up the list of assignments from the table beside me before climbing up on top of the stained wooden surface. I'd long since come to terms with my height and I usually had no problem handing out orders to people several heads taller, but the room was full of enough adult-sized people that I wanted at least a little room to breathe. Line up over here, I instructed, pointing at the space I'd just occupied. When I hand you your mission, don't just stand around, hurry up and get out of the way of the next person. Hey you there, Miss Hajime. The first man to step forwards had an easy grin, seemingly unaffected by the angry red scar that slashed up from his chin to his temple. From my experience on the rubble-hauling work crews, I recognized it as the mark left behind when an overstrained cable snaps and lashes out. This man had been extremely lucky to have only been grazed. What have you got for me and the boys today? Mr. Ewain, right? I asked out of habit, already scanning the crowded list for the notation in Ino's tidy hand indicating where the former masonry worker and his team should go. You'll be over in Kawadacho today. I want you to take your usual crew and 20 others over to the old Wakamatsu station. Get the new hands working on clearing the platforms while your experienced men start checking the stability of the service tunnels. Kawadacho, located just east of the central Shinjuku ghetto and stretching south to the encircling wall, had belonged to the 11 lords up until very recently. They'd controlled the access leading to the Kawadacho checkpoint with an iron fist, which was probably why they had so brazenly operated a slave brothel catering to deviants who wouldn't be welcome in more respectable quarters. Sadly, liberating the territory from the gang's abuses would only be the first step on the path to recovery for the sector and its long-suffering inhabitants. Utterly untouched by the Shinjuku Improvement Project, the area's infrastructure was crumbling and many of its buildings were husks barely capable of providing worthwhile shelter. Even worse, directly to the west of southern Kawadacho was the dumping area, where the hauler crews left Shinjuku's garbage and its dead in the vast dumpsters the Britannians had provided for that purpose. Those dumpsters were only replaced on a 2 or 3 month basis, which meant that the area swarmed with vermin feasting on the waste, consequently severely impacting public health in South Shinjuku. Taken together, Kawadacho was only a few short steps over a total wasteland, but abandoning the district wasn't a viable option. Living space in Shinjuku came at a premium, after all, and most of the buildings that weren't already crammed with families were just as dubious in terms of shelter as the skeletal remains of the Tokyo Women's Medical University Hospital that stood like a tombstone at the northern end of Kawadacho. Going down into the tunnels, eh? Mr. Wayne scratched at his head, before pulling a sweat-stained rag from his back pocket and tying it around his forehead. All right, sounds good. Let's see if we can get the whole of the old station cleared out by sunset. No need to strain yourself, the rubble's not going anywhere. While the man's passion for his task was a credit to his diligence, medical supplies were in frightfully short supply. The last thing I needed were working hands laid low by easily preventable workplace injuries. Also, keep an eye open for rats. I imagine there's quite a few waiting down in the station. Good, the masonry worker, an experienced old hand in his late 20s, grinned up at me. Me and the boys could use some extra protein. I waved him out with exasperated exhaustion that might have been partially faked and turned to the next job seeker. I blinked, searching for some memory of the squat, surprisingly broad woman who looked to be in her late 40s, comparatively ancient by Shinjuku standards. I don't think I've met you before, I said after a moment when I failed to put a name to the face. Have you worked with us before? Aha. The woman grunted through yellowed lips, rheumy eyes watering with exhaustion, looking up at me momentarily, before closing as she yawned. Too damned early for all this line crap, but yeah. Clearly not a morning person, I thought sympathetically. While I'd rarely had a problem waking up early, I certainly wouldn't want to face the day without some of the coffee Naoto had been kind enough to stock up our apartment with. I'll try to give her an easy task. Before I could get her name, Naoto broke into the conversation. Ah, Tanya, you don't need to worry about her. She's going to be with my team. Naoto grimaced for a moment, before turning and smiling at the woman. Good morning, Mrs. Matsukawa. Got your boning knives today? The woman grunted something indecipherable before moving off with Naoto towards the doorway of the office. I shrugged and beckoned the next person forwards. Naoto had volunteered yesterday to handle the disposal of the 281 bodies left in the wake of our operation and had put out the call for people with experience as butchers or slaughterhouse workers. Presumably, the woman had been one of those. That particular task was a priority, especially since 89 of those bodies were Britannian. At first, I had planned to leave them where they later convinced the Britannians that some outside faction had engaged in hit-and-run attacks on the gang locations independent of the local people of Shinjuku. Of course, that idea had been part of a larger plan that had succumbed to resistance from an unanticipated source, Diathard Reed. To my surprise, Diathard had flatly declined to run the story about Britannians running shady criminal operations in the ghetto. It's not enough, he'd explained via Callan's phone the afternoon after the raids. I warned you that you'd need a smoking gun if you really wanted to accomplish anything, and this isn't it. I joined to see history being made, but I can guarantee this whole thing would blow over in a week, 2 tops. Clovis would get to demand some extra gifts, a few offices would change hands, and I'd probably be helped out a window or down a flight of stairs. Until you can get something more substantive, the irritating producer had concluded, something that names big names, not just names next to big names, I'm not running it. Face it, the Britannian audience isn't going to care about tax dodges and weeping 11s. Come back when you've got something that adds up to more than a slap on the wrist. The prospect of overruling him had been extremely tempting, but I'd forced my initial frustration down after curtly telling Diathard that I'd call him back. Callan had been gratifying me indignant on my behalf, freely vocalizing my anger at the impudent man for me. I agree completely, I'd said, smiling at Callan, who'd truly been a sight for sore eyes even with the sweat rolling down her face from our hand-to-hand training session. Mr. Reed is unquestionably an ass, and it would be incredibly satisfying to decorate a wall with the contents of his skull. Unfortunately, forcing him into submission would be a losing game. Besides, he might actually have a point. A point? Callan's reply had been openly incredulous. The whole point of the operation was getting all that dirty laundry, right? The goal was to make the Brits rip themselves to pieces. If that bastard's not gonna do it, what was the point? Well, for one thing, we successfully rescued 256 women and children from the gangs. Despite my mild tone, Callan had winced. I hadn't meant it as a rebuke, but she'd clearly taken it as such. But he does have a point. One way or another, almost 100 Britannians died in Shinjuku. If that becomes public knowledge, even if we aren't implicated, the possibility of another unanticipated outburst like the Christmas incident remains. Callan had paled at the reminder and nodded her understanding. Yeah. Well, I guess we did get something. No need to be greedy, even if it does leave a bad taste in my mouth, letting that piece of shit tell us what to do. It's all about the give and take, I'd continued as we went back into the circle chalked on the training mats. While we could destroy each other, him being broken as a traitor benefits us as little as our mass execution benefits him. Twisting his arm won't do anything to benefit Japan. On the other hand, letting him run the stories he wants could benefit us both in the long run, advancing the cause. Now, let's work on your grapple again. And so for now, the secrets we had purchased with blood and bullets would remain secret. Perhaps they would enter the public sphere in the future, or perhaps they would eventually benefit the cause by way of blackmail. Another person stepped up into the small patch of empty space at the foot of my table with a chirpy "Good morning, Commander." I narrowed my eyes at the insufferably energetic boy, and a boy he was, even if he was at least 3 years my senior. The last one was almost sleepwalking, and this guy is practically exploding out of his shoes. A pity the energy levels aren't distributed more equally. "Good morning, Takahiro," I replied, resisting the urge to bark at the youth to wipe the stupid grin off his face. "You seem quite energetic this morning. I expect you to channel that vigor toward your work today, understand? More shoveling, less flexing in front of Rin and Miyu today." "No worries, Commander," Takahiro said, eyes bright and utterly devoid of shame, grin widening as the room broke into rueful and sympathetic laughter. "I'm gonna shovel up so much garbage that my biceps will get huge in no time. That way, I won't need to flex in front of the girls, I'll have one on each arm, enjoying the gun show up close." The room exploded into laughter, only some of it lecherous, at the lame joke. One of the men clustered around the table clapped Takahiro on the shoulder. In a more regimented setting, in a different life, I'd have had Takahiro down on the floor giving me push-ups until his vaunted biceps quivered with exhaustion. Here in a volunteer organization that relied on high morale to maintain group cohesion, I rewarded the attempt at humor with a raised brow. As far as stimulants go, at least bad jokes are cheaper than coffee. Even the crap sold as store-brand instant, which is admittedly still pricey, if you factor in the risks inherent in smuggling bulk goods into Shinjuku. I allowed things to quiet down before responding. "Congratulations, Takahiro," I started with a smile even I'd categorize as threatening, "for volunteering you and your crew's services as haulers for the day. There's no shortage of garbage in need of urgent disposal, including lots of nice heavy building rubble. Go see Nagata for the keys to the dump truck." I hesitated, and then relented and opted to show the boy some mercy. It would have felt like kicking a puppy otherwise. Feel free to drag your friends into it as well. After all, a job shared is a job halved, and I'm sure they'll appreciate the experience of carrying your burdens. "You bet. Thanks, Tanya." The little shit's grin somehow got even wider as he gave me a sloppy salute. "You'll never see streets as clean as they're gonna be by dinner time tonight." I'm sure I pointed at the door with an unimpressed look. "But if you have enough free time to keep dawdling around here, I might have you put it to work cleaning the sewers too." That finally got a reaction out of the kid as he hurried out the door just as a grizzled man stepped up to take his place. "All right," I turned back to my list, "I've got you on loading duty, Mr. Yanagawa. I need you to take 10 people and go find Nagata, and he'll tell you which boxes he needs you to load for the various lunch lines. Once the lunch prep is over, head to Kuyakuso Road and assist the road crew. There's plenty of potholes to be filled, and someone needs to shovel the gravel. The process continued for another 20 minutes until the last of the crew leaders closed the office door behind them as they left to find available hands, cutting off the dwindling sounds of breakfast. I hopped down from the table and dropped the assignment list, ticking off the first of many items from my internal list for the day with a sigh. From behind her desk, Ina looked up and shot me a sympathetic look. "Another day of fun and games, huh?" "Don't I know it," I groused, stretching until I felt my back pop. And not swatting Takahiro was probably the easiest item on my list today. Not swatting the old bastards in Kyoto is going to be far more taxing, even if they're technically too far away to hit. "I'm sure you'd manage to find a way if they'd really earned it," Ino reassured me, before turning back to her paperwork. "You are the reigning queen of ambushes, after all." "Don't let Major Onoda hear you say that," I replied, ignoring the warmth in my cheeks at the compliment from a highly respected comrade. "He's bad enough without such a grievous personal slight lighting a fire under him." "Go make your phone call," Ino snorted, "and quit hovering. You're distracting me from my paperwork." Resisting the urge to make a scathing parting remark, I was not hovering, no matter what Ino said. I bid the organization's quartermaster goodbye and made my way back to the apartment. Despite the short trip, every step I took was shadowed by Morihisa and Shuzo, sometimes known as Boar and Mallet, my assigned guards for the day. Naoto had pushed for round-the-clock guard assignments after my speech, pointing out that my profile was now high enough that surviving gang members might specifically target me for retaliatory attacks. I hadn't protested. If a fight broke out, I'd want backup on hand, and since I'd helped train the pair I had no doubts about their competence. As expected, no gangers lay in wait in the building's lobby nor on the staircase, and Morihisa and Shuzo took up their usual positions bracketing the door as I stepped into the apartment that had somehow become home to me over the last 7 months. The burner phone, delivered to me via a figurative railroad of hands that terminated with Nagata, who had passed it to me this morning along with the note specifying the time of the call, had only a single number saved in its list of contacts. I took a moment to spin up my enhancement suite, more as a calming mechanism than out of a serious belief that I was in imminent physical danger, and dialed the lone contact. The phone on the other end of the line rang once, and then I heard an unfortunately familiar voice, just as dispassionate as I'd remembered, greet me. "Hello, Miss Hawthorne. You've had quite the eventful week, haven't you?" "Hello," I greeted the man from Kyoto. "I would like to say that it's a pleasure to hear from you again. I will thank you for your advice. The last time we spoke, Major Onoda has been quite the boon to this organization. Your facilitation is thoroughly appreciated. And yes, I have been very busy of late. Spring is the time for new beginnings, isn't it?" "Quite," the droll voice replied, "although you could argue that every beginning entails the ending of what came before. In particular, it seems like the recent collapse of the organized underworld in Shinjuku has effectively brought an end to several potentially lucrative opportunities." "Quite the tragic development for many, I'm sure," I said, affecting a disinterested air. The preliminaries were seemingly over, which meant it was time for negotiations to begin in earnest. That said, I personally have little sympathy for drug peddlers and less for human traffickers. It's quite amusing, in a way. I'm sitting on a little ton of amphetamines and other goodies, and I have no use for any of it. Frankly, I'd be tempted to tip it all into Tokyo Bay if I wasn't so worried about the environmental impact. "How unfortunate," the man from Kyoto said, voice as dry as a desert, "but based on my understanding, it's not only the ready-to-ship product taking up your storage space, is it?" "You have good sources," I smiled joyously, baring my teeth at the wall. "You are quite well informed." Yes, Mr. Kozuki was able to handle the guards and the floor manager before they could attempt any sabotage. As a consequence, we have come into possession of a large amount of chemicals that could presumably be processed into ice with the help of some industrial lab equipment. Which we also have, and would love to see gone. I see. I could hear a pen scratching against paper as the representative of the 6 houses muttered. Well, I suppose that could be of some minor interest to my managers. It would cut down on the cost of setting up a new laboratory from scratch, although transportation would be an issue, I suppose. As you remarked during our first meeting, the maglev is a highly convenient method of transport, particularly now that direct services run between the Greater Kanto area and Kyoto. My smirk was definitely coming through my voice, but I didn't try to hide it. I had the leverage here, and too bad bargaining stratagems wouldn't work on me. I'm sure your masters will have little trouble finding eager hands to help you ship your goods, especially if you pay in specie. Trade is the lifeblood of our enterprise. I am sure my employers would be happy to properly compensate any individuals or groups in Shinjuku willing to prove themselves helpful. The mild statement was a poor veil for the threat to sponsor potential rivals for control over Shinjuku. While that had been a concern during past negotiations, things had changed despite the wealth and influence the six houses could still bring to bear. After all, it's hard to have much moral authority when you refuse to get your hands dirty. I'd be happy to provide a list of hard workers, free of charge. Think of it as a gesture of friendship. They would all be quite loyal workers as well, loyal to me. Hopefully, that would reduce the number of new spies whoever Kyoto sent managed to recruit. In fact, as a further friendly gesture, I'll let you know that we recovered more than just a ton of meth from the lab. It turns out that production did not take up the whole warehouse, leaving the remainder to serve its original role as storage space. Oh? Well, good for you, I suppose. The man from Kyoto's bland voice slipped into a disinterest so profound it had to be feigned. I don't suppose they were just storing extra tires, were they? Nothing so useful, I scoffed. In fact, nothing remotely useful at all. At least amphetamines have some medical use. Refrain, on the other hand, is just entirely useless to any but the most depraved or the most degraded. Refrain? The waver in the man's voice was barely there, just the smallest of hitches in his voice. I likely would have never noticed had my enhancement suite not overclocked my brain. How peculiar. And potentially valuable. That said, we aren't interested in any petty exchanges. How much product did you recover? One of my associates estimates roughly 400,000 doses, already packaged in vials for distribution. I casually passed on Tamaki's estimate with all of the interest of a waiter reciting the daily specials. The enthusiasm that sold my message to the people wouldn't work here. Instead, I needed to be as relentlessly and obviously bored as possible to really make my product seem worthwhile. I think there's a few injector guns included too. For a moment, the line was silent except for the slow, heavy breathing of the man from Kyoto, barely audible even with my hearing boosted to superhuman levels. Then, with an admirable attempt at a bored affectation, 400,000 doses, already packaged for sale, you say? At least for distribution, I replied with a shrug. And all of them completely useless, at least for me. You wouldn't happen to have any interest in almost 500,000 vials of Refrain, would you? I know that pharmaceuticals are outside of the two primary industries your group dabbles in, but I'm sure we could find a use for such an asset. The cultivated disinterest had returned to the man from Kyoto's voice, bland as beige. It was almost convincing. Not that we particularly need to expand at present, business is good, after all. But in such uncertain times, it's good to diversify. Of course, I readily agreed, and times are hard indeed. I wouldn't want to overly impact your organization or the good work you do. In the spirit of mutual cooperation that has marked our relationship so far, I will keep my requests modest. 400,000 kilograms of lentils or beans, 400,000 kilograms of rice or other cereals, 100,000 kilograms of soy, 50,000 kilograms of salt, and 50,000 liters of vegetable oil. Also, 4 pallets of vitamin supplements. Preferably the 500-count bottles. Impossible. The man from Kyoto snapped, mildly irritated. It can't be done. What do you even need 1,000 tons of dry goods for anyway? You might not realize, I began, choosing my words with care, that outside of Kyoto, virtually every number in Japan balances on the ragged edge of starvation, and that chronic malnutrition is the order of the day. I understand that your organization prioritizes armed confrontation, as is your prerogative as weapon manufacturers and industrialists, but please understand that a man weakened by hunger is an ineffective fighter at best, and a rotting corpse at worst. The general food insecurity of the 11 population isn't exactly a great secret, the representative replied snippily, but you're asking for too much. Several trainloads of food arriving in Shinjuku is far more difficult to hide than a few truckloads of our finest merchandise. Then don't make it a secret. I felt a familiar smile, a professional smile, spread across my face. I had him on the ropes if he was making such weak excuses. Flaunt it instead. Make it an open donation. The Rising Sun Benevolent Association is an officially registered charity, complete with a noble charter. I'm sure they would love a donation from the Numbers Advisory Council, and I'm sure your masters would love some good PR for once. We'll even send a thank you card. Audacious as always, remarked the grey man, but audacity sometimes triumphs. I will pass your proposal on to the board. I'm reasonably certain that at least one of them would be eager to champion your terms. Now, unless there's anything else? There is, in fact, I broke in. I'd like to place an order from your more standard catalogue. Oh? Interested in some bullets to accompany the beans? The dry voice spoke of mild amusement at an old and familiar joke, almost a private ritual. Indeed, and bandages too. I pulled the scribbled list of figures from my pocket. For all that Naoto had noble education under his belt, his handwriting was still nearly illegible. First, let me point out that the estimated value, as best as I could figure, for 1.2 tons of unadulterated meth is £1.8 million. You owe me, and that's not even counting the additional value of the refrain, about £480,000. Careful now, Miss Hawthorne. The dry voice was like a fingernail lightly rasping across the skin of my ear. Be very careful. Wholesale deals are quite tricky, after all. Come now, be honest, you don't have any other options besides us, do you? No need to ruin a deal that could keep every mouth in Shinjuku fed for at least a few weeks, depending on how strictly you ration it. You are definitely my preferred purchaser, but you are far from the only interested party. I'd come prepared for this sticking point in particular. I'd known that the old bastards in Kyoto would do their best to inflict an unequal deal if I didn't push for every inch, and their representative had acted exactly as I'd expected. For one, I briskly continued, I could sell the material back to the Britannians. I'd need an intermediary, but I already have one lined up. The Chinese would be more tricky, mostly due to the transportation issues, but I'd be willing to give them a discount on account of the oceanic shipping. I'm not unreasonable, and neither are my expectations. This was half a bluff on my part. I had little doubt that Diethard could find a whole series of buyers interested in retailing amphetamines, but it was unlikely he'd be willing to act as the Britannian face for a wholesale distribution operation. The Chinese were an even longer reach, although I had little doubt that the superpower across the Sea of Japan had seeded agents in every 11 ghetto near a port. It would take longer to find a broker, but it was still plausible. Half a bluff or not though, I was still confident in my abilities to sell this deal to Kyoto House. And, even if I didn't manage to close the deal, my willingness to bow and scrape for the collaborators in the ancient capital was practically spent. Their testing mission had led to a bloodbath. They had deliberately tried to put a stumbling block in my path via an order, and they had forced me to sell my organization's services to the JLF in exchange for basic supplies. There will be, I swore to myself, a reckoning. Japan will be independent with or without these honorary parasites, and fair weather friends will not be spared the rope if examples prove necessary. If they can't or won't help us now, then they are Britannians in all but blood. A minute passed in silence, and then another. Digging for every scrap of information I could find, I tuned my enhancement suite to boost my hearing yet further still. Over the line, I could still hear the rhythmic breathing of the man from Kyoto, accompanied by the ever-so-faint periodic scratching of pen on paper. There must be someone else in the room with him, I realized. He's the mouthpiece, but they're passing notes and giving him his instructions. My schedule is quite cramped today, I said, breaking the silence, and I know you're not alone. I also know that you were sufficiently expendable to be sent to a low-level meeting in the Tokyo settlement. If you cannot make a decision, kindly pass the phone over to someone who can. The regular breaths stilled, and for a moment I wondered if I'd gone too far. Then, a moment later, another voice came onto the line. How'd you mate, Anya? I've heard surprisingly much about you. The new voice was robust, but a quaver betrayed the second stranger's advanced age. Some have started calling you the savior of Shinjuku. Others whisper that you have the blessing of the kami and that the dust and wind disguise your appearance and conceal your footfalls. Quite remarkable rumors for a hafu who can't even claim to be a teenager. I've never claimed to be a savior, I replied, keeping the anger at that old familiar slur from my voice as I balled my free hand into a fist. Nor do I claim divine blessing. I will, however, claim my identity as Japanese, no matter what color my eyes are or who my father was. Indeed, I've never been anything but Japanese, something that I doubt you can say no matter how black your hair is. They say you're quite the passionate one. The elderly voice chuckled into the line, and that rumor at the very least is true. Perhaps the other ones are too. After all, 1,000 tons of foodstuffs would feed every mouth in Shinjuku. But only for a few days, perhaps 2 weeks if everybody got a single meal a day, I cut in, and as far as I can tell, the approximate value of the food would only come to £180,000, plus shipping. The pharmaceuticals I've got are easily worth 12 times that amount. I fully anticipate that you will come out ahead in our dealings, but I won't be fobbed off with a pittance while the city around me starves. Passionate indeed. Perhaps too much. Don't push me, girl. I've buried better than you. The musing tone and geriatric cadence abruptly switched to a rough, almost ursine growl. You're good, but you're not special. You have a talent for organization, but you are arrogant as well, arrogant and easily baited. Young blood might run hot, but a loose tongue will see you broken on a wheel if left uncontrolled. The familiar grandstanding of the old, powerful, and complacent. I snarled internally. As if I didn't already know that my entire life is spent dancing on the edge of a knife. Threats are meaningless unless backed by action, I riposted, entirely unimpressed with the old codger's threats, and I have yet to see anything from you or your house that indicates the necessary testicular fortitude to follow through. You are powerful, I admit, powerful and rich, but the sharpest sword is useless in hands too weak to lift it. I stopped myself before I could truly let my rage take me. Collaborators or not, they are still useful. No need to burn bridges before I've crossed them. But, I injected a conciliatory note into my voice, we truly are on the same side, aren't we? The ultimate aim of the 6 houses is the liberation of Japan, for what else would justify the willful endangerment of your cushy positions in the Britannian administration? I have the same goal. And, while I respect how you and yours have kept the hearth fire of Japanese freedom banked through these bitter years, the times are changing. Can't you feel it in the wind? The status quo has been dead for almost 4 months now. Liberation doesn't mean the same thing to everybody, the quavering voice remarked, and there are many different possible Japans that could rise from the embers if that happy day ever truly comes. The enemy of my enemy is not my friend, no matter how similar our goals may be. True enough, I acknowledged, but no matter what Japan the future might hold, a land empty of its people is a hollow victory at best. At this moment, my primary concern is keeping as many of our people alive as possible. Whoever pushes the Britannians off our sacred shores will need strong backs and full bellies to rebuild a nation once again. Surely we can find common ground over that shared goal? Indeed, the man on the other end of the line grumbled, cadence slowing down once more. But people will remember who brought them food. Gratitude is fleeting as far as coins go. But it buys power. At least as long as the bellies are full. You can take the credit. The answer was obvious. It was absurd that this was even an issue. I already told your man that the Rising Sun would happily send a thank you card for your donation of food. I meant that sincerely. If you are willing to sell and ship food to Shinjuku, you are free to take the credit as publicly as you wish. I would be willing to praise your name in the meeting hall if that would help ease your worries. Humph. The voice wavered indecisively, the aged quaver strengthening as the thoughtful hum dragged on. Well, what else were you going to ask for? Out with it. Let's hear what you have to say. 2 more shipments of the same composition and value, to be shipped at your cost, I replied promptly, which would come to about £540,000 in total. Further, I have 2 lists of further inventory items, one of construction materials and some tools, the other of your usual stock in trade, namely munitions. I loosened my tightly clenched fist, flexing my fingers to try to get the pins and needles of impacted circulation out. I wouldn't want to bore you by reading them out in full, so I will deliver them via your agent, Asahara, instead. There's nothing overly exotic on either. And the total? The old man's voice had relaxed a bit too, just slightly. The firm tone typical to hardball negotiators the world over was still present, but the fire had banked. Come on, girl, I know you have it. You've had every other number on hand. £250,000 for the construction equipment and tools, £400,000 for the weapons, I smoothly replied, quickly consulting Naoto's notes. Together with the food shipments, that's a total of £1,390,000. Deducted from the estimated value of the drugs, Kyoto House stands to profit by £890,000, complete with favourable PR. Done, the old man barked, some of the vigour returning to his voice, contingent on the reception of your lists and the verification of the estimated prices, and contingent on an analysis of the product's purity conducted by our personnel. I accept, I said, the word sweet on my tongue. If I were back in the Japan of my first life, I would have been raked over the coals for agreeing to such a lopsided deal. Here, at the head of a comparatively powerless insurrectionary body, I was just happy that negotiations had been civilized for once. I didn't even need to kill anybody this time. Perhaps even the old bastards can learn. Good. Good. The vigor faded, leaving a tired old man behind once more. We'll be in touch soon. Hajime Tanya. I will be watching your career with interest. Take care. And you as well, Mr. Kyoto, the typical pleasantry sliding effortlessly off my tongue as I relaxed at the familiar ritual marking the end of a business call. And long live Japan. A minute hesitation, and then a murmured voice replied. Long live Japan, and long live the imperial family. Revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. And with that, the phone went dead in my hand. I dropped it on the battered old table and collapsed down onto Ogi's bunk, suddenly exhausted. I had done it. I had secured possibly the most important deal of my life. There would be food for a while, long enough for arms to grow strong and for minds to focus beyond aching bellies. And in those minds, at least for a while, Japan would live on for just a little while longer. April 26, 2016 ATB, Shinjuku Ghetto, Tokyo Settlement. 1235, and I met with the technician Kyoto House dispatched to evaluate the purity and quantity of the samples this morning. I stopped to take a bite of my bean soup, helping the spoonful of lentils down with a quick sip of water. Happily, he had no complaints about either. So, that's it then, right? Asked Naoto from the end of the table. The deal's done? That's right, I confirmed, and judging by how surprised Kyoto's man was, the quality of the product was quite high. Which, I continued contemplatively, probably means that the 6 houses got an even better deal out of this than they'd anticipated. Well, hopefully, they'll put at least some of that money back into helping Japan, Ino said, although she didn't sound particularly optimistic. But even if they don't, a windfall like that might make negotiations easier the next time around. Assuming this doesn't all blow up in our faces somehow, I replied, trying not to sound too dour. For all we know, a major donation from a third party will give Clovis, or somebody close to him, an excuse to end the food dole. After all, 11s don't need to eat that much, right? And Clovis Land North isn't going to pay for itself. Early on in his reign as Area 11's vice-regal governor, Prince Clovis had proclaimed that nobody would starve under his benevolent leadership. While the Britannian press had lauded the prince's fair but firm paternalistic heart to the skies, it had been blatantly obvious to everybody that some form of food aid was necessary if the area wanted a workforce after the mass starvation during the first year after the conquest. To accomplish the lofty goal of ending starvation in Area 11, Clovis had instituted a food distribution program in the urban ghettos across the area. Like most things Britannian, the program had been poorly thought out and rife with corruption. The food deliveries came irregularly, and the food that ended up in Shinjuku was far too little and often already rotten by the time it arrived. Much of it also fell into the hands of local gangs and petty warlords. In spite of the mismanagement and cut corners, the program had worked as intended. Crews of hollow-cheeked workers overseen by better-fed honorary Britannians had built the Britannian concession and the ever-expanding Tokyo settlement. Hungry workers with just enough calories to survive a day's hard labor had stepped up for the chance to work in poorly managed and incredibly unsafe manufactories, at the constantly busy docks, and on innumerable job sites. Of course, the work crews had never been acknowledged for their hard labor. The Britannians credited the speedy rise of their abomination of a city to their civilianized construction KMFs, the great machines strengthening the foundations of the empire on and off the battlefield. While the construction nightmares had proven invaluable, without the efforts of tens of thousands of 11s, the concession that loomed over Tokyo on massive stilt-like supports would still be decades in the future. But, the food had kept the ghetto alive too, even as the concession rose and the settlement spread. Indeed, The ingredients in the soup I had purchased with my labor during the years between the conquest and the death of my mother had come from that dole. The fact that I had been practically a walking skeleton when I met Ogi and Naoto spoke volumes about the food program's efficacy, but the same could be said for the fact that I was alive to meet them at all. If the prince is going to halt the distribution over something so petty, then it was always going to happen sometime or another, Suichiro said, speaking up for the first time since our working lunch had begun. That being said, I don't know how I feel about turning to honoraries to keep us alive. I understand that we don't have a choice, but food is food, Naoto opined with a shrug, and these particular honoraries are the same ones funding the JLF. They really are the best option, for now at least. For now, Suichiro reluctantly agreed. I still don't like it, though. I like starving to death less. I gestured with my spoon. Predictably, the grumbling ceased at the reminder of the most likely alternative. Pride and ideological purity couldn't fill empty stomachs, after all. Moving on to the next topic, I pushed the empty bowl away from me. How is the reunion plan going? Mixed results, I'd say, the logistics officer replied. We've managed to find a few of the girls' families, but, well, most of them don't really have families. Not anymore. Some of them might still have relatives in Saitama, but unless we load them on a truck and have Nagata drive them over for a visit. I understand, I said, closing my eyes as I thought for a moment. I had put Ino in charge of the slaves we had liberated during the raids, and she had delegated the task to Kasumi, her assistant and a former slave liberated from a gang herself. Kasumi had spent the last 3 days working herself to the bone to find surviving relatives to place the women and girls with, but it sounded like efforts had stalled out. I suppose we could hand them over to Chihiro, Naoto said, voice slow and full of reservation. The unspoken but hung heavily over the table. I mean, she has taken care of most of the rest. Chihiro is already unstable, I replied firmly, and I am increasingly dubious of her value to the organization. She was intoxicated when I last met with her in the middle of the day and was both insubordinate and insulting. I would rather relieve her of command than entrust 200 vulnerable people into her care. I agree with Tanya. Chihiro's recent behavior has been deplorable. Ino's voice was hard and heated. I understand that she's grieving, but we've all lost people and Makoto died weeks ago. If she can't handle loss without going to pieces, we can't let her stay a leader, especially not if she's becoming a drunk. Well, if we're not dumping them into Chihiro's lap, what are we going to do with them? Naoto's tone was carefully neutral, although I doubted he had any more love for Chihiro than I did. She had never bothered to hide her antipathy for his mixed heritage any more than she had her feelings about mine. Things are hard enough as is in Shinjuku without our own miniature refugee crisis. Break them up into groups of 10, with each group consisting of women of roughly the same age? I suggested, turning to look at Naoto. The adult groups can be distributed throughout the Rising Sun's area of control. Ask the council for volunteers to host them, and let them know that they'll get bonus rations for hosting. The children, I hesitated, the children can stay in vacant apartments in our building. There are at least a few units empty, I think. Delegation, huh? Naoto smiled knowingly. Can't say I'm surprised. I'll raise the matter at the meeting at 1600. Fine. I think that's all of our outstanding business handled, yes? I drummed my fingers quickly, scanning the other 3 faces around the table. All right. Let's get to why I called you here today. Besides the food? Ino grinned as she licked her spoon clean. I thought you just wanted to share a meal with us, Tanya. I am hurt to hear that you had something else in mind. You'll survive, I dryly replied in the face of snickers from Naoto and Ino and a single muffled cough from Suichiro. More to the point, we need to start thinking on a bigger scale. The deal with Kyoto is part of that, but even in that case we're still thinking too small. £1 million worth of food is too small, huh? Naoto asked as he leaned back in his chair, the question clearly rhetorical. No, I get what you mean. 500,000 kilograms of food isn't very big, not when you're talking about a city. That's right, I agreed. Let's talk about scale. At the moment, the Kozuki organization itself has, in total, just over 100 members, most of whom are still undergoing training at the school. The Rising Sun Benevolent Association has maybe 20 dedicated members who aren't also part of the organization. Naoto, how many members would you say the Sun Guard has? I'm estimating somewhere between 1,700 and 2,000. Naoto looked up at the ceiling for a moment, presumably distracted with internal calculations. I'd say a bit more than that, but definitely no more than 2,500. And that's pushing it. Let's call it 2,000, I settled, which gives us just over 2,100 bodies across all three organizations. In other words, including non-combatants and untrained fighters armed only with sticks and knives, we have 1% of Shinjuku affiliated with us. That's not enough to control the ghetto, much less conduct offensive operations. So, you're saying we need to recruit? Suichiro asked, leaning forwards over his bowl. I don't know how much use we'd get out of more recruits at the moment. Not until we can put guns in their hands, at least. True, we can't do much to expand our combat power at the moment, I nodded at the former police officer, and I'm hoping the new arms we're purchasing from the 6 houses help with that particular problem. However, an army, even a guerrilla one, needs more than just frontline fighters. We also need to recruit engineers and medics, teamsters and administrators, mechanics, and even cooks. And then, I said, pausing slightly for effect, there's intelligence. We have Diethid and Kalin, but 2 agents aren't enough. We need to find the people in the ghetto who have work tickets and regular engagements in the settlement, the ones who work as cleaners, janitors, and laborers in the concession itself. Britannian arrogance likely keeps most of the occupiers from noticing servants, but they all have eyes and ears. I stood up and began to pace back and forth as I continued. Up until now, we've operated as a small, independent, armed band. We controlled limited amounts of territory, but virtually everybody in our organization was expected to be a frontline fighter, ready to pick up a gun at a moment's notice. We can no longer afford to think on such a limited level. When we took over Shinjuku, I continued, we also took on the organizational requirements that come from running Shinjuku. A gang, or a militia, can't run a city. We know that for a fact. They simply lack organizational depth. Now, unless we want to lose control of the ghetto in a few months, we need to stop thinking like a militia and start thinking like an army. Can you explain what you mean, Tanya? Naoto inquired. I mean, we've already implemented a training system or the start of one, and we've got something like a social services division with the Rising Sun and all that. That's beyond what gangs tend to do already, correct? True, I agreed, we've made a good start, but there's still a great deal to accomplish. For one, we need to start focusing on establishing institutions. Right now, everything is run on a more or less ad hoc basis, with personal loyalty to local leadership binding the organization together. That will have to change. Personal loyalty only lasts as long as leaders can consistently deliver victory, and victory is never consistent over the long haul. We also need to start cultivating specialist units, particularly when we're talking about non-combat services. Ino's an excellent quartermaster, and Nagato is a good driver, but what happens if they die? The institutional knowledge and skills die with them, without any clear idea about who takes over. No individual, not even you or I, Naoto, should be irreplaceable in an organization dedicated to fighting an empire that spans multiple continents. I let that sit for a moment, giving my audience time to absorb my points. Change was difficult, but in our case, very necessary. The only reward for good work was, always, more work. Still, I was optimistic. My comrades had always risen to the challenge before, and I fully expected they would again. On another topic, I said a minute or so later, we need to start thinking outside of Shinjuku. The outside world doesn't stop at the ghetto's wall, and we need to stay on top of things. The situation in Niigata is turning into a quagmire for the Britannians, and while I'm sure the JLF are ecstatic about it, the rising food prices aren't helping matters here. Worse, the Britannians are also increasingly aware of the threat represented by Japanese uprisings. Their complacency is waning in favor of paranoia. Sooner or later, they will act on that fear. At the moment, the Rising Sun has a presence only in Shinjuku, and the Kozuki organization only has a single small outpost outside these walls. This is an issue for many reasons, the worst of which is that Shinjuku is entirely indefensible. I turned on my heel to face my fellow insurgents. Which brings me to my next point, we need to increase the scale of our operations, both in terms of expanding our organization and in terms of ensuring that we cannot be destroyed by a single catastrophe. We have put all of our eggs in a single basket, haven't we? Naoto remarked, but expanding beyond Shinjuku is a pretty broad umbrella. I mean, for one thing, if we're already overstretched trying to keep the ghetto under control, how are we going to find the manpower to establish branches elsewhere? And how do we make sure they stay loyal? That's a resource investment all on its own, especially if we intend to expand Rising Sun's operations too. I think we should start relatively small, I said, nodding to acknowledge our leader's point. I left half of the graduated trainees behind at the school to act as a training cadre. I think that, combined with Ogi and Major Inoda, they can handle another training cohort or two ahead of schedule. The sooner we can turn militia into soldiers, the better. As for further expansion, we need more on-the-ground information, first-hand observations, to get a feeling for the available options. I recommend deploying the 2 squads of trained fighters I brought with me as scouts. Major Inoda has trained them all in infiltration, long-range scouting, and information collection. They will also be useful in training anyone we recruit with the potential to play a dedicated undercover role, amongst the enemy. Or, I thought, amongst our alleged allies. Kusakabe's surely up to something, considering his recent promotion, and I need to know what he's planning before he blindsides us as well as the Britannians. Can I add something? Suichiro asked, and continued after I nodded and sat back down, leaving the proverbial and little floor to him as he rose from his chair. The school. It's in Gunma. My family's ancestral homeland. I've got a few cousins there, and if they're still alive, they're farmers. Even before the conquest, people were leaving Gunma, heading to the cities. That means there are plenty of empty villages and fields. They just need to be cleared out, rebuilt. So, in a frown, you're thinking about sending civilians to Gunma too, not just trainees? That would actually solve a fair number of issues, but that would also be a huge resource investment. But it would be an investment too, Suichiro countered. After all, every bushel of rice we can grow is one less we need to buy from the running dogs sitting in Kyoto. Beyond that, what happens if another Christmas incident happens, only this time directed at Shinjuku? Every civilian we can get away from the mobs, the better. The older man glared at the rest of us. We're here to protect them, aren't we? That's our job. That's why we're talking about food instead of bombs. To protect the people. That was unusually spirited for Suichiro. I remembered when I had first met him, back when Tamaki had brought him to the old basement headquarters. The former police officer had been a broken man, still mourning the loss of both of his sons, one to a Britannian bomb and the other to an honorary Britannian citizenship. Now, months later, he was vigorous, and years had fallen away from his graying head. You make a compelling point, I replied after a moment, and I agree that we need to invest in our people's future. That said, I can't agree with this concept unless we have more tangible information to work with. For starters, we need to see if your cousins are still alive and if they're willing to help teach people how to farm. Also, if they have any seed grain available for sale. Also, Ino chimed in, we need to find 1 or 2 of those abandoned villages to use as models. At the very least, we'll need to figure out if we need to send one of our generators out there for power, not to mention portable stoves, water purifiers. The list goes on. And we need to figure out how the JLF will respond, Naoto added. From what you reported, Tanya, the Britannian presence in northwestern Gunma is pretty light, but the JLF maintains a presence. The last thing we need is a fight over territory with them, or to get in the way of some sort of operation they're planning. Or even worse, stumble into some extra-secret Brit operation or base. They do have a habit of showing up where you least want them. Quite, I agreed and turned back to Suichiro. How do you feel about taking the lead on this one, Suichiro? You're the one with the personal connections to the locals, as well as some familiarity with the area. Ogi can introduce you to Major Inoda to cover the JLF angle. I suspect, I continued, a note of annoyance creeping into my voice, that the Major will have absolutely no problem collaborating with you. I'd be honored, Suichiro responded, bowing slightly at the waist. It's been far too long since I last went home. Good, I said, continuing briskly along. I'm planning on sending Tamaki, his squad of pet goons, and about 40 sun guards to the school. Find 2 or 3 people to help you out in Gunma, and you can travel with them. Get a list of what you'll need together, including whatever gifts might be necessary. You'll be heading out in 2 days. Very well. Suichiro pushed his chair back under the table and retrieved his hat. I'll begin my preparations immediately. Thank you for entrusting this mission to me. Thank you for your idea, I replied, waving a quick goodbye as he left before turning back to my 2 comrades. We waited in silence as the sound of footsteps receded down the hallway, and then continued to sit quietly until Shuzo, Mallet, poked his head in through the door. He left the building without talking to anybody, Mom, he reported, and it looks like he's heading back towards the meeting hall. Thank you, Shuzo, I said, acknowledging his report with a nod, not looking away from my comrades as the soldier withdrew from the room. Your thoughts? I don't think he's the mole, Naoto said thoughtfully. I didn't think he was before the meeting, and I don't think he is now. Definitely not for the 6 houses, at least. No way he'd work with them. The disgust in his voice was too real. I don't think that his son working for one of their companies means anything important. It's pretty clear that Keith is dead to him. It could be a long con, Ino countered unenthusiastically. I mean, it could be. I just don't see Suichiro being able to pull it off. He's, well, painfully straight-laced? Naoto supplied with a slash of a grin. Yes, during the time we've worked together, he's always struck me as a by-the-books man, very uncomfortable with duplicity or misdirection. He's also hierarchy-focused, I mused, thinking about how Suichiro still lapsed into a more formal cadence whenever he replied to questions or orders. I'm inclined to agree. If he's a spy, he certainly isn't Kyoto's. Which, Naoto began with a heavy sigh, leaves Chihiro. Unless anybody thinks Nagata or Tamaki is telling tales out of school? Not Tamaki, but I have considered Nagata as a real possibility, I admitted. He was around to hear about the Lacey Gata plan, and considering how much he cares about them, his wife and child represent a solid hook. On the other hand, he was also the one who volunteered to introduce me to Mr. Asahara, and he's the one Kyoto House used to pass the burner to me. The fact that he's openly associated with a Kyoto agent makes it hard to believe that he's a spy. I mean, unless he doesn't know he's a spy? For all he knows, Naoto pointed out, he's just talking with a friend or whoever about what he's doing, and that friend is passing information on. I'm not saying it's likely, but maybe our problem isn't a mole, but just loose lips? That's possible, I allowed, and I really hope that you are correct about that. The idea that any of our comrades have been informing on us to anybody, even nominal allies, is distressing. That was putting it mildly. It had become increasingly clear that Kyoto House had a source close to the Kozuki organization if not inside it, a source that had kept them annoyingly well informed about our group and our operations and internal dynamics. I had not wanted to acknowledge the possibility, but my conversation with Kyoto the other day had forced my hand. If I had to negotiate with Kyoto House, I couldn't allow information leakage, accidental or deliberate. Do you really think Chihiro could be spying on us? Ino asked, her tone full of a curiosity that I would call idle if I didn't know how proactive she could be. I know that she dislikes both of you for stupid reasons, but that doesn't make her a spy. She's also not the only one who feels like that in Shinjuku, I'm sorry to say. I think Tanya and I are both fully aware of that, Naoto dryly replied, but no, I don't think she's a spy. She wears her heart on her sleeve and is completely unable to control herself when she gets angry. I'm pretty sure she'd have outed herself by now if she was a traitor. No, it probably isn't her directly, I agreed with a shake of my head. Given how much she hates Britannia, and myself and Naoto by association, I don't see her doing a bunch of powerful, shadowy, collaborators any favors on purpose. Alternatively, she could think that she's talking to a spy for the JLF or some other resistance group and have no idea who she's really feeding info to, Naoto mused. It's not like a spy would be above lying about their loyalties. Slowly, I nodded as I turned the idea over in my head. While he usually blended in quite well with the rest of us these days, a far cry from his occasionally ignorant or overly sensitive reactions back when I had first met him, sometimes it was still obvious that Naoto was from a Britannian noble family, at least as a bastard. After all, when it comes to duplicity, who can rival the Britannian nobility in their mastery of the art? Perhaps, I allowed, Or maybe she simply lacks any grasp of operational security. Like with Nagata, rather than being a mole specifically, she might just be overly talkative. Alcohol in abundance will do that to a person, after all. Her hotel headquarters seemed pretty chaotic as well. It'd be hard to keep tabs on everybody there. It might not even be a person, her place could be bugged to listen to her drunken rants. Naoto rubbed his chin. That's a good point. On the other hand, we have plenty of reasons to shit-can Chihiro, even if she isn't a spy. Or, Ino interrupted, we could simply remove her from that environment and send her elsewhere. She's very passionate, and she clearly understands how to appeal to people. All of her girls follow her first, us second. Expelling her from the group could lead to a fracture. On the other hand, sending her on a scouting or a recruiting mission elsewhere could turn her back into an asset. And separating her from her power base would give us a chance to bring them back into the fold, I said, nodding along to Ino's point, preserving resources and maintaining institutional homogeneity. Saitama might be a bit too close for that, but Yokohama's almost 30 kilometers away. And the largest Britannian naval base in the area is less than 10 kilometers from the Yokohama ghetto, down at Yokosuka, Ino pointed out. I know that she's not exactly trained as a scout or an infiltrator, but surely even an untrained observer could dig up something of use down there. At the very least, she could warn us if all of the Marines start heading north towards Tokyo. I agreed. Hopefully, though, having her work in an environment rich with acceptable targets will prove a useful outlet for her issues, especially if she doesn't think she has to worry about us hovering over her. And that dovetails neatly with our pre-existing plan to scout for potential expansion opportunities outside of Shinjuku. Yes, about that, Naoto leaned back in again. Where were you thinking of sending your teams, Tanya? One team's going to Maebashi, I replied immediately. If our fallback location from Shinjuku is going to be Gunma, which Suichiro's suggestion would probably lead to, we need eyes and ears in the prefectural capital. It's also the largest city in the prefecture, and probably the best place for local recruits. The proximity to the school will help us shuffle training cohorts in and out, along with supplies. As for the second location, I was thinking either Mito, in Ibaraki Prefecture, or Utsunomiya in Tochigi. I haven't made up my mind about which would be better, though. Each has strong arguments for and against. More of Tochigi Prefecture is rural, and it borders Gunma, meaning it has many of the same advantages. A foothold in Ibaraki, on the other hand, might allow us to form connections with the seaborne smuggling community. Go for Ibaraki, Naoto replied firmly. The Oi Sosaki and Oiwa shrines are both located in the province, and can personally attest that Oiwa, at least, was still intact if abandoned as of 3 years ago. Lord Daikoku, the god of nation building, is enshrined on the Oi coast. His blessing will surely help us prevail. Well, I suppose such sentiments could prove helpful for recruitment, I conceded. Naoto, religious foibles or not, was the leader of the group for a reason. Perhaps he had seen something I'd overlooked. I'm sure Yoshi will enjoy some seaside air as well. April 26, 2016 ATB, Shinjuku Ghetto, Tokyo Settlement. 1507. Mrs. Tsuchiya, right? I exchanged bows with the woman, noting the vaguely harried look in her eyes. Please, come in. Have a seat. Thank you very much, Miss Hajime. Despite her weathered features and the deep stress lines carved across her cheeks, Tsuchiya Hitomi still moved gracefully, carefully pulling out her chair before perching on the very edge, legs primly crossed. The years had not been kind to the former assistant principal, though I knew she was 38, she looked like she was already in her mid-50s. I want to thank you for responding so quickly to my message, I began, smiling politely from across Ino's desk. As soon as I proposed this initiative, Kanamayogi all but insisted that you be involved. He was quite effusive in his praise of your skills as an educator and an administrator. I'm very happy to hear that, the one-time assistant principal of Toyama Junior and Senior High School replied. I was also very happy to hear that Mr. Kaname was still alive. I haven't heard from him in years. I'm sure he'd be happy to catch up with you whenever he's next back in Shinjuku, I said smoothly, falling into the familiar cadence of office conversations across time and worlds, although he is unfortunately away on assignment at present. Oh, that's... Mrs. Tsuchiya struggled for a reply for a moment. Good, I suppose? I will look forward to the occasion. Indeed, I smiled. Now, on to business. I don't want to waste any more of your valuable time, Mrs. Tsuchiya, so I will be brief. Education is practically non-existent in the ghetto, except in the special case of the Shinjuku School for 11s, where anything useful is so buried in propaganda that the whole structure is a net loss. It is long past time to tackle this issue. I'm definitely not against the idea, Mrs. Tsuchiya said, her voice slow and heavy with some emotion I couldn't quite pinpoint. But how? I know of the Rising Sun, and I respect your work. You've fed me and my husband for a month now. But, and meaning no disrespect, you barely hold Shinjuku. Is this really something you can afford to focus on? We can't afford not to focus on it. In that, I was certain. The greatest wars are fought in the heart and the mind. What happens on the battlefield is just the byproduct. Make no mistake, the Britannians have sought to occupy our minds just as much as they have sought to break our bodies. I paused, casting my mind back over the nearly 6 long years that had passed since the conquest, searching for tangible examples of what I meant. There were too many painful memories to count, but 2 in particular would serve me well here. I saw the ashes of Naruko Tenjin Shrine myself. I have also sat through classes in the school for 11s. I know of what I speak. If we do not teach the next generation, then we will be the last generation. Education for the Japanese and by the Japanese is the heart and soul of our struggle. I see, I think. The former educator muttered, clearly mulling my words over. After a moment, she appeared to come to a decision. All right, Miss Hajime, you make a compelling case. And, it's been far too long since I've heard anyone speak so passionately in favor of education, so, what are you looking for from me? How can I help? I can't quite tell if she's on board and asking for assignments, or if she's still non-committal and asking what her responsibilities would be. Why is she dragging her feet? I wondered, slightly frustrated by the ambiguity of the situation. Does she think this is a job interview? Ogi said she was the best chance we have for reforming anything like a functional educational system. For a moment, I tried to put myself in Mrs. Tsuchiya's shoes. She was a well-educated woman who had been a key member in an important pillar of pre-conquest society, a high school attended by children of the upper middle class. After years of desperation and struggle, it must be shocking to so suddenly be called back to duty. I have the utmost faith in your skills, I reassured the older woman, and I am sure the children under the Rising Sun's care are eager to learn, if only so they have some structure to rely upon. I'm sure you understand how hard it is to feel secure when your daily schedule is unpredictable. That's very true, Mrs. Tsuchiya replied fervently, and structure is definitely important when it comes to education and childcare. But, what exactly is it that you need from me? First and foremost, I said, I need names. Ogi said that I should ask you for the names of other teachers, tutors, or other educators who might still live in Shinjuku. I'm not expecting you to teach the next generation by yourself, after all. I smiled politely, waiting for the obligatory chuckle in response to the ludicrous concept I just floated, but Mrs. Tsuchiya just looked relieved for some reason. Did she think I was expecting her to handle all 80,000 children in Shinjuku on her own? Nonplussed, I continued. You will be given a budget to recruit any of your fellow teachers. We have a reserve of Britannian currency, but we can also pay in increased rations or by providing small luxury items on request, I explained. Once you manage to recruit some staff, start working on a curriculum, and start working on a book list. I will put a bounty out on books that you recommend, so hopefully we won't need Britannian textbooks. Oh, and also, I continued as inspiration struck, if you or the people you find happen to know any technical or vocational instructors, that would be useful too. We'll need to teach adults how to be electricians, welders, mechanics, and the like. And once you've got a curriculum and a materials list sorted out, well, I shrugged. I'm not going to dictate your job to you. Let me know what you will need to educate the children. I can set aside some of the rooms in the more intact office buildings for classrooms if those would be adequate. Otherwise, I'm sure I can find some families willing to host sessions in their apartments. I might be busy in the near future, but Ino Naomi will be on hand to help you out. Ah, good. That's good to hear. Miss Tsuchiya smiled, bobbing her head in a nod of acknowledgement. And, she continued, somewhat hesitantly, are you going to be joining the classes, Miss Hajime? Ah, I replied eloquently, blinking in surprise. Sorry, what? I don't know anything about education, so I'm afraid I wouldn't be able to help you conduct the classes. Ino knows at least as much about the local supply situation as I do, so I don't think I can help you much there either. But... And now Mrs. Tsuchiya was the one blinking in confusion. But didn't you say you wanted the children under the Rising Sun's care to be educated? Weren't you going to include yourself? There's no way you're over 12, you must have been in first or second grade during the conquest. I stared blankly at the former teacher, who I noticed had suddenly turned pale. That's right. Biologically, I just celebrated my 12th birthday a month ago. I had almost forgotten that I'm still a child. Suddenly, Mrs. Tsuchiya's hesitant dithering made a great deal more sense. It must be strange as a teacher to take orders from a preteen. To rely on a child to keep you fed. She must have known before she had come, but seeing is believing, as the old line went. I'm sorry, Mrs. Tsuchiya said, her words jumbled, rushing over one another. I didn't mean any disrespect. I know that you're quite important, and as a leader, you must be very busy. I'm sure you don't have any time, and you're clearly doing well for yourself. No disrespect taken, I replied, holding up a hand to forestall the torrent of words. As soon as I raised my hand, the woman, old enough to be my mother, nearly bit her tongue as she slammed her jaws closed. I didn't mean to alarm you. It's just been a while since I remembered that I am technically a child. For some reason, Mrs. Tsuchiya looked incredibly sad for a moment, before her face firmed back up again. Well, Miss Hajime, that's not entirely uncommon here in Shinjuku, I suppose. Lots of children have been forced to grow up far too quickly. I made it to the 4th grade, you know, I commented idly. I was lucky enough to start kindergarten course early, and I managed to skip the 3rd grade. It was meaningless trivia, but something inside me thrummed unpleasantly at the reminder of those long-gone days, when I still thought I had a chance to find a peaceful life. My mother was very invested in my education. She was always very invested in me, wasn't she? Even if she didn't need to be. I felt a lump in my throat. And where did it get her? Working hard for nothing, because she ended up in a dumpster all the same. I see. Mrs. Tsuchiya said, her voice a bit hoarse. I guess it isn't a surprise that you were a quick study, considering where you're sitting now. Thank you for this opportunity, Miss Hajime. I'd be honored if you chose to attend my class, but of course, I wouldn't want to impose. I will start reaching out to my old colleagues immediately. I'm sure they will be overjoyed to have the opportunity to teach again. Thank you for your time, I replied politely, if distractedly. The itchy heat in my eyes made it hard to focus, and a woman almost a year dead kept derailing my train of thought. I appreciate your willingness to work with me. I am looking forward to hearing back from you soon. The now no longer former teacher said a polite goodbye that I could barely hear before all but fleeing from the office. I remained behind Ino's desk for a few seconds, waiting until the sound of her footsteps disappeared into the hustle and bustle of the main hall before I got up, walked to the office door, and engaged the lock. Ogi was in Gunma, Callan was in Ashford, and Naoto and Ino were very busy, too busy to bother. Aside from those four, I didn't want anybody else to see me cry. May 2, 2016 ATB, Outpost No. 2, Chuo Ward, Tokyo Settlement. 1707. The gate of the Chuo outpost slammed shut on Corporal Kurgi and his fireteam's heels. For the first time in months, they were out of uniform and outside of the confining walls of Britannian encampments. It was Monday night, and 2nd Company had, as a unit, been granted 24-hour liberty, starting 7 minutes ago. There was, Corporal Kurorugi reflected, something darkly amusing about Britannian officers giving their men any liberty. It wasn't as if they particularly cared about their men, nor the regulations stipulating the leave troops were supposed to receive in the wake of a combat assignment. No, Corporal Kurorugi was certain that the sudden decision to give the regiment a day of liberty, staggered out so only a company at a time would be free, had come as a consequence of the suddenly plummeting state of the 1st Regiment's morale after the return from Toyama. Even the Britannians, his superiors in rank and race, couldn't miss the men's sudden dourness, and even the Britannians weren't foolish enough to brush the suddenly sour mood off completely. I think they were surprised at how hard everybody took losing the guns, Kurorugi thought, bouncing idly on his heels as he stood in the street. It was a habit from his childhood he'd never quite lost. Lelouch had once remarked that his thoughts, unencumbered by obstructions in his empty head, must be striking the sides of his skull hard enough to lift him off his feet. Suzaku had whacked his friend over the head for that, carefully pulling his strength so he didn't hit too hard. And then Nunnally had chided her brother, and as always that had brought Lelouch to the point of an immediate apology. As soon as the regiment had stepped off their buses in Tokyo 3 days ago, they had formed up on the parade ground. The humidity had been sweltering, even in the early evening, and the heavy uniforms and the helmets complete with full face masks hadn't helped in the slightest. In that thick, sweaty heat, company by company, the regiment had been disarmed. Each honorary Britannian had stepped up in turn to one of the tables manned by officers from the military police, all under the watchful eye of their Britannian platoon and company leaders. Each soldier had surrendered the pistol and ammunition he had been issued, along with his bulletproof vest, and had made his mark in the record book next to his name and ID number, all the while trying to ignore the ominous presence of the 2 night police Glasgow's looming over the growing heap of military material. Corporal Kurorugi wondered if the other men in the ranks, silent and faceless behind their masks, had noticed how schooled their officers' expressions had been, how white their fingers were, clenched together behind their backs in otherwise perfect parade rest. How the military policemen sitting at the tables had tensed up slightly every time an honorary reached for his pistol. Even if the others hadn't noticed the Britannians' fear, the implicit message of the whole hours-long process hadn't been lost on them. During their time in Toyama, the men of the 1st Regiment had been given their moment in the sun. They had been issued weapons, real weapons, and sent into the field to conduct crucial missions at the request of the prefect of Toyama himself. Now, they were being humbled. After the shameful assembly, the men were herded back into their barracks and reintroduced to the panoply of petty slights that came with garrison life. The quality of their food plummeted, just like Corporal Kurorugi had predicted, and the men had to reacclimate to old bread and beans after weeks of fresh seafood. The daily routine of endless busy work returned as well, and while mopping already clean floors had been a boring if tolerable task before Toyama, even the most stolid in the ranks were having a hard time adjusting now. Privately, Corporal Kurorugi sympathized, even as he pushed the 4 privates of his fire team relentlessly in every petty task that came their way. It had been easier to handle the exact nature of their assignment in Toyama while he'd still been out in the field. The action, the need to stay present and engaged, the stakes. All of that had made it easier to push the nature of his work to the back of his mind. His mantra, all for the plan, had been more than enough to assuage any lingering qualms. But back in the barracks with nothing but the internal politics of the regiment to distract him, it was far more difficult to push all of those faces away. All of the pale faces staring at him from the back of a truck as he slammed the tailgate up. All the pale faces uttering imploring words he hadn't bothered to hear as he'd stuck his gun under their noses. He had hated to do it, hated himself for helping with the oppression of his people, but he'd had no choice. Not really. It was all for the plan, Kurorugi told himself with a final bounce, before reaching up to adjust his shades. He could feel the eyes of his 4 subordinates, on liberty or not, he was still in charge. He couldn't forget that. Time's ticking. All for the plan. Only through the plan can a truly ordered society emerge. And only by giving my people the security they deserve, the peace and the quiet provided by that ordered society, will my hands ever be anything close to clean again. Follow, Corporal Kurorugi said, and strode away from the outpost, carefully listening as first 1, then 2, then 4 sets of footsteps fell in behind him. Some of the tension in his shoulders eased. His men were still obeying his orders. That was good. It's unfortunate, he reflected, that they only obey out of fear. Instructor Todo always said that fear could only carry respect's burden for so long. Even if my father disagreed. Fear is power, Kurorugi Jinbu had once told him in one of their rare father-son conversations. Love is transitory, gratitude short-lived, and greed is always unmanned by fear in the kind of men who chose politics over the battlefield. They all make for useful tools, but the only way to truly lead is through fear. A leader nobody fears is no leader at all. Maybe that's why the men were so eager to give up? Suzaku's quiet, treacherous voice asked from inside Kurorugi's mind. After it happened, after father died. Nobody really seemed sad to see him go. Nobody who knew him, at least. It was, Corporal Kurugi decided as he pushed Suzaku back into his box, his men's fault that he had been forced to terrorize them into compliance. He hadn't wanted it to be this way. He had tried to teach them to respect lawful authority, doing his best to pound the regulations into their skulls. Ultimately, his men had taken away a slightly different lesson than Kurugi had intended. They'd learned that the law was important, but only so long as the law was enforced by might. It was a very Britannian lesson and one that his four-man section had learned very well. To Kurugi's grudging pride, his men had all become adept barracks room lawyers under his tutelage as well as fearsome brawlers, equally good at leveraging obscure regulations to carry out his orders as they were with their fists and their feet. They had eagerly learned every one of Todo's hand-to-hand lessons that Kurugi could recall. He would put his fire team up against any other in the entire regiment, even the brigade. That didn't change the fact that his four privates only followed Corporal Kurugi out of fear. He had physically dominated them almost from the day of his promotion in early spring, and that physical dominance had been reinforced by his actions in toy armor. For now, that fear was enough, but it meant that Kurugi could never show weakness or vulnerability. Obedience rooted in fear would only remain for as long as his men feared him. To his frustration, Kurugi Suzaku couldn't see a way out of his situation besides doubling down. The parallels of the situation weren't lost on him. He knew that tyranny would only engender eventual resistance. But he just didn't know what else he could do. Loyalty was built on trust, and he couldn't trust his men. Any one of them could be an informer, after all. He also couldn't trust them to take the long view and understand the sacrifices necessary for long-term security. Once again, he was trapped in a situation that he hated, doing things that he hated, and turning those whom he should be protecting into his enemies. I don't beat them because I want to, I beat them because I have to, Corporal Kurugi thought, internally glum as he tried to rationalize his behavior to himself. I just wish I could trust them to understand. It would make everything so much easier if I didn't have to drive them forwards. But every army, he supposed, needed foot soldiers as well as leaders. His soldiers didn't really need to understand, at least not yet, as long as they obeyed for now. Corporal Kurugi was thinking in the long term, and that was all that was really necessary. He could recruit fellow travelers as he found them, men who understood as he did that if their people were ever to have anything close to safety and security, they couldn't afford to be rash or in any way lenient. It was fine if his subordinates thought of themselves as a tiny gang, he told himself, with himself as their feared leader. He didn't care what they thought, and it was a useful fiction for now. Corporal Kurugi had big plans, and his men would help him achieve his goals one way or another. In Toyama, Kurugi had realized that he couldn't afford to sit on his thumbs and wait patiently for the Britannians to accept him into their good graces. Corporal Kurugi could in time become Sergeant Kurugi, and perhaps eventually Sergeant Major Kurugi, but he would never rise beyond that point. Regulations or not, time and grade didn't matter so long as the men doling out the promotions refused to recognize his service and contributions. It was just another of the many ways in which Britannia fell short of the dream it had sold to a young Kurugi Suzaku. The plan would set it right. The plan was not a necessarily fixed set of steps, it was more of a set of generalized goals and realizations, which had coalesced and evolved over time. First, the Christmas bonfires had burned away his illusions about the current leadership. The soil of toy armor had fertilized his imagination of what sort of home Britannia could provide for his people. Independence was a full stream, but so was the hope that his people would be safe under the current leadership. The honorary Britannians were the key. Hated by both the unassimilated 11s and the Britannian lower class, they were nonetheless the only bridge between the Britannian state and 11s, and so they would have to be the vanguard. The Britannians, Kurugi could see, had lost their way. For all their talk of social Darwinism and the success of the best at the expense of the rest, social mobility was stymied by class and by blood. The Britannian philosophy, as far as Kurugi saw it, made sense, but its implementation was flawed, leading to weak leaders such as Major Humphrey and Prince Clovis, weak leaders who couldn't protect his people, which meant that his people needed to protect themselves inside Britannia. They started from a handicap, as did all number populations, but unlike all the other subjected populations, Suzaku knew that his people still had a deep reserve of strength, and Kurugi concurred. How else would his people still be able to fight 6 years after the conquest? But strength of character wasn't enough, not on its own. Left to their own devices, his people would destroy themselves. In Toyama, Kurorugi had finally managed to square the circle. His people would be safe, and the strongest and smartest would rise through strict meritocracy, rigorously following the tenets of social Darwinism made manifest. They would overcome the barriers imposed by race and by class by becoming more Britannian than the Britannians. Kurorugi would be the Emperor's most loyal servant, and an Area 11 would become a land of security, if not of freedom, instead of a wasteland of systemic abuse and rebellion. But to achieve that new dream, Corporal Kurorugi would have to play the game by its current rules. In truth, he had already begun to play. He had earned his second chevron by giving his Britannian officer what he wanted, exchanging personal favors for promotion. He had, in effect, found his way into the game of patronage, if on a very low level. Unfortunately, Lieutenant Rockwell and his guilty conscience couldn't elevate him any further. Indeed, the lieutenant had seemed increasingly wary of Corporal Kurorugi over the last month and had ceased confiding in him at all in Toyama. This meant that Kurorugi would need to find a new patron, someone with greater reach and vision. But how? The question had bedeviled Kurorugi for the last few days. His thoughts on the matter often turned to Lelouch. Sometimes, Kurorugi wished for his childhood friend's silver tongue. For all of his devotion to the rule of law, Kurorugi had ultimately been forced to resort to his fists to earn the obedience of his men, and his attempts to insinuate himself into Rockwell's life had only worked as well as they had because of the lieutenant's disgust with the Christmas incident. Lelouch, he was sure, would have had them all pledging undying allegiance with a single conversation. But I don't have Lelouch's guile, nor his charm, Kurorugi thought, relentlessly smashing past his own thoughts of what could have been. So I'm going to have to do things my own way. And if I can't find a patron for now, I'll handle the other matter. I can't let myself stagnate. He'd scoured his mind for memories of Britannia, trying to remember what he'd seen in the Britannian commoners who had risen through the ranks unsupported by noble connections or wealthy families. He recalled anecdotes his own father had shared with him, as well as the things he'd said to Todo and the others when he was in his cups. How to exhibit leadership potential, how to project authority and strength irrespective of the truth. A true leader takes the initiative, Kurorugi thought. He doesn't just wait for an opportunity to knock, he seizes his own fortune with both hands. I need to make my own luck. He thought back to the murmurs he'd heard of honoraries taking handouts, of his own people heaping shame upon the rest of them just to fill their own bellies. He remembered the sneers on the faces of the Britannians as they joked about how a beggar once is a beggar always, and how they'd pointedly looked at him. And I know just how to do it. It would hurt, and they would hate him for it, but it needed to be done. Not only for the plan, but for their own good. Sometimes doing the right thing was hard. That didn't make it any less right. After all, it's like my father always said. Spare the rod, spoil the child. All right, listen up, Kurorugi said, voice cold and steady as he slowed, allowing his men to group up as they continued down the road. It's time to get to work. We are soldiers of Britannia and the enforcers of her will. We are honorary Britannians, not filthy numbers. Unfortunately, not everybody remembers the oath they swore. We're going to help remind them of their pride, and their duty, as sworn citizens of Britannia. Sure thing, Corp, one of his men, John, or as he was once known, Senku, replied. We're always down to provide some legal education. The other three men snickered, and Kurorugi feigned a smile. He knew exactly what they meant. They'd cornered a particularly weedy private from 3rd Company a few nights back when he'd foolishly chosen to use 2nd Company's showers. They'd provided enough education on the proper assignment of facilities per His Imperial Majesty's military code that the man had trouble walking the next day. Without warning, Corporal Kurorugi turned on his heel and buried his fist into John's stomach, sending the man doubling over, gasping for breath. It's Corporal, John, Kurorugi reprimanded, not corporation. You must always address a superior with the rank and respect they are due. Camaraderie is already impossible, Kurorugi thought, and I do not need sycophants. These men are tools until proven otherwise, and I will not hesitate to remind them of their purpose. Why, you got it, Corporal, John wheezed, walking on as best as he could as he fought to catch his breath. Kurorugi slowed just a bit. He didn't want to have to repeat himself for John once the man caught back up. Anyway, Kurorugi continued, forcing himself to play the part his plan demanded. It's come to my attention that many of our people have started taking food handouts, lowering themselves back into the same category as the numbers who rely on Prince Clovis's generosity to remain alive. This is unacceptable. As honorary Britannians, we can never let the Britannians think of us as numbers. The moment they do, we lose everything we've fought for. So, what are we going to do? One of the other men asked, flinching slightly as Kurorugi smiled back at him. Provide legal education, Kurorugi quipped with a tight smile. After all, I don't think that a charity handing out food is likely to bother with all of that paperwork, do you? I bet they haven't filed an assembly permit or bought a distribution license. Even if they did, whoever's driving the truck probably won't have them on hand to show a group of concerned citizens, now will they? Probably not, John agreed, still rubbing at his abdomen, but, not to disagree with your plan, Corporal, but there are only 5 of us, and none of us have guns. We could definitely take any 5 random hungry civilians, or even any 10, but are we really going to take on a whole mob by ourselves? Yes, Corporal Kurorugi immediately replied. Yes, we are. They are undisciplined and weak, otherwise they wouldn't be taking charity and risking their status. But we'll be stopping to pick up some. Oh, let's just call them some educational implements first. Legal ones, of course. The purchase was legal. Corporal Kurorugi had even insisted on a receipt at the sporting goods store. The pimply clerk behind the counter had been a bit nervous about the 5 honorary Britannians buying baseball bats and fixed-blade camping knives, but he had been reassured by Kurorugi's military ID and the implication that the small group was on a quietly deniable mission. He'd even wished Kurorugi a nice night as he'd handed over the receipt. It hadn't taken long to find the offensive soup kitchen once they'd left the sporting goods store, bats in hand. Some helpful soul had stapled flyers to utility poles throughout the honorary Britannian neighborhoods surrounding the walled Shinjuku ghetto. To Kurorugi's surprise, at least one of the arcologies housing the poorer Britannians in the settlement had likewise been carpeted by the flyers, at least one hung on every street, all with the same address and time. When his little band arrived at the small pocket park, Kurorugi was surprised and disappointed to see that the small green space was absolutely thronged with people, some still in line but most sitting on the grass or a curb, eating a spicy scented soup from cheap ceramic bowls. To his mild consternation, at least a few Britannians were sitting in the dirt with his fellow honoraries. True, these Britannians looked even more ragged than some of the honoraries, but it was still astonishing. Times really must be getting hard, Kurorugi heard John muttering to one of the other soldiers as they pushed their way through the densely crowded park. A few people turned to protest the sudden shoves, but most cringed back when they saw the 5 out-of-uniform soldiers. A few glared, but glaring impotently at their betters was all they could do. Just like with the Britannians, over these 6 long years, Kurorugi thought. I know what that's like, swallowing your pride to survive. I will have to teach them to stand up and fight for their rights. If you don't fight, nobody will ever respect you. If the honoraries don't fight, my project is doomed to failure. I know they can fight, Suzaku thought, loud inside his mind. My people are still strong. We're still strong. The problem isn't that they can't fight, it's that they don't have the weapons, the leadership, or the organization. All of which I can provide, given time, Kurorugi thought, shoving his way past a family. It just takes discipline, patience, resilience, and a refusal to give in and give up. These people should know better. They made the sacrifice to become honorary Britannians, and now they're just licking up free food? It's just another drug, another weakness. I've beaten the weakness out of my fire team, and I'll beat it out of the rest of the honorary Britannians if I must. I wonder if Father would be proud of us? Suzaku thought, his tone mournful and bitter. We're turning out just like him, aren't we? Kurorugi Jinbu was a fool, just like how these people are fools, replied Kurorugi, forcing Suzaku out of the way. I will not make his mistakes. I am Kurorugi Suzaku, not Kurorugi Jinbu, and I will save my people even if they curse me for the next 1,000 years. With the thought still ringing in his mind, Corporal Kurorugi finally broke through the packed crowd in front of the serving line itself, flanked by his fire team. He found himself in an open space centered on a line of portable tables creaking under the weight of portable stoves and heavy tureens and pots full of piping hot soup, a truck parked off to one side. Kururugi looked over the line of servers behind the pots with cold eyes as they took notice of his arrival. Judging by their tattered clothes, they were 11s, all of them. His people, but those who hadn't seen the wisdom of embracing Britannian strength. Surprisingly, none of the servers looked down or away, and each met his gaze without flinching. Idiots, the lot of them, Kururugi thought, internally shaking his head in dismay. It's this same stupid pride that led to all the violence in Niigata. If they just knew their place and were patient, none of this would happen. I wouldn't have needed to go to Toyama, and I wouldn't need to be here tonight. They keep forcing me to do horrible things, and I hate it. Who are you? A strident female voice demanded in heavily accented Britannian from somewhere to Kururugi's right, and why are you trying to skip the line? Thankful for the distraction from his turbulent thoughts, Kururugi turned and sized up the talkative 11. She was tall for a woman, almost his height, and her face and clothes were clean and well maintained. Indeed, if it wasn't for the hakamaki holding her long, indigo hair out of her face, he would have mistaken her for an honorary Britannian. Corporal Kururugi, of His Majesty's 32nd Honorary Legion, 1st Brigade, 1st Regiment, 2nd Company, he said, identifying himself in the same language as his men spread out behind him. And who are you? Naomi, came the curt reply, of the Rising Sun Benevolent Association. You're free to join us for supper, Corporal. Naomi's voice faltered for a moment, and Kururugi grimaced. She'd clearly just recognized his name, but you need to get in line with the rest. Ah, so you're the one in charge here? She clearly was, as the only one speaking up, but Kururugi was only really asking as a formality anyway. I'm surprised to see an 11 outside of the ghetto, handing out food to honorary Britannians. Surely looking after your own people should be your priority? My own people? Naomi raised an eyebrow. I'm afraid I don't know what you mean, Corporal. All who want help are welcome under the rays of the rising sun, and unfortunately, many of your people are still recovering from the incident at the beginning of the year. You know exactly what I mean, Kururugi ground out, already tired of this game. This damned stubborn pride, just like in Toyama. Just like father. Your people are the ones who rely on Prince Clovis's generosity for your food. If you somehow scrape together enough to buy extra, you should enjoy it in the ghetto, where you belong. We who have taken the oath don't need your handouts. We're not stuck in the past, choking on our pride like you. Choking on our pride? The woman replied incredulously, we're the ones choking on our pride? Corporal, you get fed by the army. Do you have any idea how much the price of food has gone up over the last year? Do you think that all of these people are queuing up for soup for fun? Life is hard. Life has always been hard. Kururugi began to stalk across the tarmac toward the 11. And if good honoraries continue to take the easy way out that you're providing them, it will never be anything but hard. The only way the lot of honorary Britannians will improve is by demonstrating our strength. Squatting in parks with free soup is what your kind do, and as long as we accept handouts from you, the Britannians will never see us as equals. See you as equals? The woman had the gall to laugh. They will never see you as their equal, Corporal. You could be a general and they'll still only see your 11 face and your 11 name. You will never be anything but a dog to them, and the moment you bark too loud, they'll put you down. Enough, Kururugi growled, bat in hand. I wish I still had my pistol. Sports equipment just isn't threatening enough to scare people into listening to me. If the officers trusted us more, we'd be able to do a far better job carrying out these missions, and things would be better for everybody, Britannian, honorary, and 11 alike. As a citizen of Area 11 and a soldier in His Majesty's Armed Forces, I demand to see your food distribution permit, your assembly permit, proof of rental for the park, your access permit to the settlement, and all other relevant paperwork. As he continued down his list, Kururugi began walking towards the 11 leader. Did you think you had the right to be here, number? He felt angry eyes on his back and a snarl twisting its way across his face. Do they think I want to be here? Do they think I want to do this? You should have stayed home in Shinjuku. Just take the damned oath if you want to get out of the gutter and back on your feet. Around him, the crowd muttered with discontent, but nobody, not the 11 servers nor the mass of onlooking honorary Britannians, stepped forward to intervene. Naomi hadn't budged, and stood, back straight and hands by her sides, staring directly at him. She showed no signs of movement. Well, Kurorugi prompted, stopping a few feet away from the bitch with the familiar red circle sun on her brow, the same one that had once graced the flag that had hung behind his father's chair, back in his sumptuous office. The same flag father had stood in front of when he'd issued that order to resist to the last, as well as that other order. "Where are your papers, number? You're looking for our papers?" A new voice broke in on the encounter from somewhere off to Corporal Kurorugi's left. Carefully, not taking his eyes off Naomi, he took a half step back and to the side, trying to turn his head just far enough to see where the voice was coming from without taking his eyes off the troublemaker. "I have them here. I think you'll find everything is in order, Sergeant." "It's Corporal," Kurorugi replied in a growl, eyes scanning for where the voice was coming from. "If you've got something to show me, come here and give it to me." From his side, John let out a muffled gasp, followed immediately by an equally quiet "Oh, fuck." With a curse of his own between his teeth, Kurorugi took another step away from the potential troublemaker, putting distance between them in case she tried to rush him when his back was turned, and followed John's gaze out into the crowd. Stepping out from behind the parked truck was a Britannian woman, a girl about Kurorugi's own age. That would have been bad enough, a number-loving Britannian would have required careful handling, after all, but as soon as Kurorugi laid eyes upon her, it was hard to resist following in John's steps and cursing their luck. The Britannian was obviously a noble. Kurorugi could practically smell the stink of aristocracy rolling off of her from across the park's parking lot turned handout station. While she was wearing an unremarkable outfit of slacks, a man's button-up shirt, and a vest, even Kurorugi could tell the garments were high quality and likely obscenely expensive. Even more tellingly, Kurorugi couldn't remember the last time he'd seen someone move with such implicit arrogance. He hadn't seen anybody act like that since Lelouch first arrived in Japan, 8 long years ago. Worst yet, the woman. No, the lady was absolutely, stunningly beautiful. Kurorugi couldn't believe how quickly his luck had curdled. A number-loving stunner of a noble was perhaps the greatest complicating factor for this entirely unsanctioned and self-assigned mission, second only to Lelouch suddenly putting in an appearance. He had no possible leverage over the lady, nor could he possibly intimidate her. Even attempting to do so would be extremely dangerous. "Ma'am," Kurorugi said in his most respectful tones, slowly lowering the baseball bat as she approached, "begging your pardon. Are you the one responsible for this charitable operation?" "No," the lady replied, "that would be rivals." "Rivals Cardimund, of the Gold Coast Cardimunds?" She gestured, and Kurorugi suddenly realized that there were, in fact, 2 nobles in attendance, the male. The young lord dressed in a very high-class school uniform. He is, in fact, the chairman of the board for the Benevolent Association. It operates under his charter. "I see," Kurorugi slowly replied, trying to establish his options. Suddenly, they were all various shades of distasteful and counterproductive. Damn it. If I don't play my cards right, I could endanger the whole plan. I shouldn't have been so cocky, but how could I have predicted this? Britannian nobles setting up some kind of charity to help honoraries. Impossible. Kurorugi forced himself to take a breath and focus. That's all irrelevant. Right now, I need to find a way out. Fortunately, all of my actions up until now have been within the law. Well, Kurorugi turned to the noble in the uniform. "In that case, my lord, would you mind if I checked the permitting for this distribution? I'm sure you filed all the correct documents, sir, but it would help set my mind at ease if I knew that everything here was in accordance with the law." Well, the Lord, Rivals, glanced over at his companion for a moment. "I guess. It's the most curious thing, Corporal," the young lady interjected, seemingly ignoring Cardimund entirely. Her gawky companion's half-open mouth snapped shut as he turned to her in surprised deference. Behind his shades, Kurorugi's eyes narrowed. "And she says he's in charge? I notice you're not in uniform. And you said you're a soldier in His Majesty's Armed Forces. The 32nd Legion, I believe?" The lady continued, the predatory gleam in her eye growing brighter with every word. "Now, I'm just a student at Ashford Academy, so correct me if I'm wrong, but unless the vice-regal governor has declared martial law again, you don't have any law enforcement duties over civilians, now do you?" "That's..." Kurorugi gritted his teeth. "That's true. But, begging your pardon, my lady, my men and I have just returned from counterinsurgency operations in Toyama. Seeing numbers set up in a settlement is making me a bit jumpy. After all, Who knows if they're rebels or sympathizers? I'm sure nobody employed by you would be, but I'd just like to make sure. Oh? The lady arched an imperious brow. And is there any reason I should indulge this whim of yours? Kurorugi bit his cheek so hard he could taste blood. No, my lady. There is not. For a moment, they stood there in tableau, the lady looming over him for all that she was half a head shorter and Kurorugi trying to ignore the sweat trickling down his back. He was a soldier, hardened by combat, and a proud honorary Britannian who'd carried out the Empire's will with dedication and energy, but that had all been for the plan. A plan that was rapidly unraveling at the first hurdle. He could feel the situation sliding away from him, away from control. It was all for the plan. Kurorugi thought, mind frantic. I can't have it all mean nothing. Not now. But there was nothing he could do. Not with the lady standing before him, radiating purebred noble power and a supremely arrogant confidence as her stunning sapphire eyes roamed him up and down. He felt like an irritant, an insect, helpless before that cool gaze. Finally, the spell broke as the lady rolled her beautiful cerulean eyes. I suppose I've wasted enough time with this foolishness, she said, stepping forward and pulling a folder from the satchel hanging at her side. Here you go, Corporal. I can save you a look if you'd like. Naomi over here filed all the paperwork herself, and she's an expert at it. To Kurorugi's astonished rage, the red-headed noble casually slung a friendly arm over the number's shoulders. Why am I so angry about this? Suzaku thought, his internal voice cool and considering while surrounded by a maelstrom of emotion. I should be happy that some Britannian other than Lelouch actually sees us as people. They look like they're friends. Why am I so angry about this? Kurorugi wondered. It's what I want. Recognition of our skills and our worth, to work hand in hand with the Britannians for the betterment of both our peoples. What am I even doing here? Desperate for distraction from his treacherous thoughts, Kurorugi accepted the folder and flipped it open. Just as promised, a thick sheaf of very official paperwork greeted his eyes. Gloomily, Kurorugi pored through the first several layers. He didn't really know what he was looking for. He hadn't anticipated the damned numbers to actually have a signed and stamped assembly permit on hand. After a brief show of paging through the folder, he returned it to the lady. Everything seems to be in order, my lady, Kurorugi replied through a grimacing smile. Thank you very much for your help setting my mind at ease. I greatly appreciate it. Oh, don't thank me, the lady demurred. Thank Naomi instead. After all, she's the one who handled the paperwork. A beat passed, and the lady's eyes narrowed just a touch. Do it, Corporal. Thank her for helping you protect us. I could kill her, Kurorugi mused. In less than a second, I could drive my bat into her sternum, right between her breasts. She'd bend forwards, and I'd drive the butt down into her head. The knife at my belt would slash the 11's throat open. It would be easy. But he could see the look in her eye, even as she smiled. The way her body tensed just so, the way her lips twitched up as she met his furious gaze. It all seemed to taunt him. He could almost hear her arrogant voice in his ear, saying just give me a reason. That's exactly what she wants, isn't it? Besides, it was, he knew, a fantasy, a way of coping with the apex predator whose shadow had just passed over him. Perhaps if the world was different, if life was different. But it was not different. In this world, Kurorugi had no recourse, no way to fight back against a Britannian noble without effectively cutting his own throat. At least, not yet. Someday, Kurorugi promised himself, someday. Discipline, patience, and sacrifice. All for the plan. He carefully did not think about the thrill of fear deep inside at the prospect of defying the Britannians. Of what happened to those who defied the Britannians. He certainly didn't think about the way his heart leapt at the thought of that fate. Of finally being punished, broken on the wheel. Justice at last, not for this act of defiance, but another. Thank you, Miss Naomi. The words were like sand mixed with ashes in his mouth, gritty and abrasive and choking. I commend your bureaucratic skills. Crossing every T and dotting every I. You are a credit to your mistress. You're most welcome, Corporal Kurorugi, the 11 purred. Kurorugi's eyes widened. She'd said that in Japanese. A language that honorary Britannians were forbidden by law to use. She'd spoken in Japanese in front of a noble. It's so good to see that Japan's sons continue to watch over her people. Teeth clenched, Kurorugi turned on his heel and strode away, back the way he had come. After a moment, 4 sets of footsteps fell in dutifully behind him. To Kurorugi's finely tuned senses, that moment rang loudly in the quiet air of the park. His team's confidence in his strength had been shaken by this miniature fiasco. They'd seen him weak and helpless, caught in a cerulean ocean and barely able to swim. There would be consequences if he didn't move quickly. Back to the barracks, he commanded after they'd put a block between themselves and the park, and when we get there, get changed into your training gear. Liberty or not, we have plenty to do before we get sent back out into the field. Clear? Kurorugi paused. When nobody responded immediately, he turned and snarled at his 4 fellow honoraries. Did I fucking stutter? Are we clear? That got a round of yes, Corporal, from all present, but Kurorugi wasn't fooled. Obedience rooted in fear only lasted as long as strength persisted. It was clear that his fire team needed a reminder of just how much strength Todokio's Heroes Prize student could still bring to bear. As the small knot of out-of-uniform Britannian soldiers wandered away, Callan slowly let out a tense breath. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Yoshi pick up a ladle with his left hand, which moments before had been creeping behind his back to the pistol she knew was hidden underneath his dirty white shirt. Next to her, Ino sagged slightly, wavering slightly on her feet as the last of the bat-toting thugs left the park. Has that happened before? Rivals piped up, speaking quickly and nervously from behind her. Callan straightened back up and stepped away from Ino, patting the other woman on the shoulder as she turned to Rivals. She was proud to see that, although her classmate was obviously nervous, his hands were steady, not shaking in the slightest. He's come a long way since Christmas, Callan thought, remembering a much younger Rivals. Vomit streaked down the front of his uniform and his hands full of glass. He's grown. I mean, Rivals continued, eyes still wary as he darted a look back at the entrance to the park. I think this is the 5th or 6th time I've come out to help, but is this new, or have I just been lucky? This is new, the Stadtfeld heiress reassured her friend, and when had that happened? Sometimes someone from the night police loiters nearby, and sometimes we get the odd drunk yelling at us from the street, but I think this is the first time we've been hassled by a gang. She forced a laugh. Not really much to steal here, is there? Just soup. Eh? Rivals turned away from the entrance to shoot her an incredulous glance. You think they were actually a gang? The tall one claimed to be a soldier, right? Corporal Kururu or whatever? You think that was just a lie or something? I didn't see any uniforms or ID, Callan shrugged, so yeah, I'd say a gang. Doesn't really matter if they have day jobs when they're wandering around looking for trouble. I don't think that the army's quite at the point of issuing baseball bats to its men. You've got a point, Rivals said with a brief chuckle before rapidly sobering back up. Do you think that they were? He looked side to side at the milling crowd that had once again begun to line up for free soup before leaning in and whispering, do you think they were some of the guys who were smashing stuff up and, hurting people around Christmas? No, Callan replied, shaking her head. No, if anything, I think that they might have come from the same unit as the soldier we found. The 32nd Honorary Legion. I think those were probably some of his comrades. Oh. Rivals looked mildly ill at the reminder, his lips pressed together and practically white from the pressure. Then, I'm not getting something. Why were they here messing with us when we're trying to help people? Why was that Kurorugi so deferential to a pair of Brits like us, if we, I don't know, Callan said, half truthfully. I'm sure it makes some kind of sense to them. Look, she said, casting about for something else to talk about. Can you run this folder back to the truck? And let Nagata know that it's probably time to start packing up. Rivals nodded and turned to head off. Oh, and Rivals? The student paused and turned back to Callan. Thanks for the backup there. You really helped keep things from getting nasty. You did good. Anytime, Callan. Rivals flashed his increasingly rare puppy dog smile at her. She smiled back, her expression just a bit brittle. It feels good to be able to help out the cause, just a bit. As her fellow student jogged away, Callan let herself feel guilty about her newest deceptions for a moment, before shoving the useless emotion away. Rivals was a friend, but he was an agent as well, even if he didn't know it. And agents were tools, to be used and sacrificed to achieve objectives. Rivals had played his role as a living smokescreen to perfection, diffusing a potentially sticky situation without blood or fuss in the process. Truthfully, a sticky situation didn't even begin to cover how complicated things could have been, had matters come to blows. For one thing, while rivals hadn't understood the importance of the Kurorugi name, Callan had recognized the name of the Republic's last prime minister. She couldn't even begin to fathom how the son of one of Japan's leading families, one that descended from a cadet branch of the imperial house, no less, had ended up in uniform. Exchanging a significant look with Ino, a silent promise that we'll talk about this later, Callan set to work with a will, slinging soup, scrubbing endless bowls, and hauling heavy sacks of garbage for the next half hour as the stream of hungry mouths gradually slowed to a stop. A productive night, Callan thought with satisfaction. I bet we managed to feed at least 800 people, maybe even 9. Pity it'll be the last one for a while. That particular decision had come down from the leadership earlier that day. Her brother had announced their decision that morning, that, in order to guarantee food supplies inside Shinjuku, the food relief program for the honorary Britannians would effectively be brought to an end. Tonight's distribution had already been scheduled and had supplies set aside for it, so was allowed to proceed, but it would be the last for the foreseeable future. Callan didn't know how she'd break the news to rivals. He really enjoyed participating, and while he didn't spend much time scrubbing pots and pans, everybody who came seemed to relish the chance to talk to a real Britannian noble, especially one who truly was friendly to the core. Interestingly, from what Callan had picked up from Tanya's call earlier that day passing on Naoto's decision, the end to the honorary distributions hadn't been part of the leadership's plan. If Tanya was to be believed, for the first time in its short history the Council of Local Notables, as the political body Naoto had cobbled together had named themselves, had prevailed upon the leadership. The collection of local headmen and power brokers had claimed to be the representatives of the people of Shinjuku, and as a sort of miniature diet, had all but demanded the end to food donations for those outside the walls. The leadership had opted to concede the point. It will give us a chance to stockpile foodstuffs, Tanya had said over the phone, clearly trying to rationalize the loss into some kind of victory, and it will display our commitment to the needs of the people. We can't rule by force and terror alone, Callan. We'd just become another gang, and gangs are inherently unstable. Only through the consent of the governed and popular support can we hope to maintain control over Shinjuku. Callan had made all the appropriate noises, playing her role as confidant to the hilt. Privately, she had her doubts. While Tanya sounded like she knew what she was talking about, Callan thought she was overemphasizing the say this council should have. After all, Rising Sun had all the guns, food, and money. What did they need from the council? Then again, maybe that's just the Britannian in me, Callan thought with a shiver of disgust. It had been far too easy to get into her character as a Britannian heiress, a role she only played infrequently, even at Ashford. The last time she'd played it was probably when she'd stood with rivals under a hanged man. It's weird how just playing that role kinda has a hangover. It's easy to think like a Britannian. It's hard to think in Japanese. As Callan made her way back from the dumpsters, another load of trash deposited in the hulking steel beast, her thoughts lingered on the honorary Britannian soldiers who had come by earlier. She had told rivals that she didn't understand why they had come, or what they'd hoped to gain, but that had been half a lie. Every time after sinking too deeply into Lady Callan's Tatfeld, she felt an almost overwhelming need to prove that she truly was Kozuki Callan. She imagined that Corporal Kurorugi Suzuku, saddled with a cursed name, would be willing to do a great deal if it meant becoming someone else. After all, she'd been willing to follow her big brother into danger over and over before Tanya had interceded. What would she have done if she was trying to gain acceptance from someone who actively hated her? A quiet cough startled Callan out of her uncomfortable self-reflection. "Oh, excuse me," she blurted out instinctively. Too late she realized she'd spoken in Japanese, and that the young man she'd almost run into was Britannian. "Don't worry about it," the young man replied in the same language, although spoken with a slight homeland accent. "You just looked a bit lost in your thoughts, and I wanted to know if you were all right." "Ah, well, I'm fine," Callan smiled uneasily at the Britannian. He looked vaguely familiar. It was something about the jawline, but the blonde hair and green eyes didn't quite ring any bells. "Thanks for asking, though." "It's my pleasure," the blonde smiled, a simple heartwarming expression that somehow radiated a sincere joy in her company. That was quite the alarming situation earlier, wasn't it? I swear, the whole area's going to the dogs, when random gangs can just terrorize anybody they want. Interesting times, huh? Callan smiled back at the man. He was, she guessed, about her age. Maybe a year older. Judging by his clothes, he was definitely at least middle class, and maybe on the lower end of the rich. Perhaps he came from a wealthy commoner family, or maybe from a cadet house a bit down on their luck. You can say that again, the man chortled to himself. Interesting times indeed. An event that nobody is allowed to talk about, a housing crisis, an uprising in the mountains, and now a food crunch, all in less than 5 months. And now, our esteemed vice-regal governor is just dumping a ton of free money out in an attempt to convince us that everything is fine and well in hand. The smile turned roguish. Makes you wonder what'll happen in a month's time, eh, Lady Staffeldt? You're quite well informed, Callan replied, suddenly feeling very much on the back foot. How does he know my name? I've never met him before. Maybe rivals brought another student along? He did bring that friend of his back in March. And yeah, I'm not too certain about how well the give everyone £500 plan is going to work out. As the man nodded thoughtfully, Callan frantically groped for more details from the news article she'd skimmed a few days back before throwing the copy of the Messenger into the trash where it belonged. I'm looking forward to the new holiday on the 4th, though. Britannia Day, huh? Ah yes, for some reason, the man's smile tightened across his face, almost to the point where Callan would call it a rictus. It's a wonderful idea. I'm not really sure how well it will catch on. Not like many people know about a dead pair of royals, nor care. Neither exactly stood to inherit anything. I'll be honest, I'd forgotten they even existed. Callan agreed with a nod, but if they get me a day off from school, well, I'll happily pour one out for little Lelouch and, I don't remember the princess's name. Nunnally. The man said, helping her out. Her name was Nunnally. Ah, that's right, Nunnally Britannia, Callan said cheerfully, keeping her curiosity carefully concealed. Something about the way the man had said that name was odd. The first time he'd said the long-dead girl's name, it had practically throbbed with emotion. The repetition had still carried a strange inflection. Well, I'll pour out some juice to her memory as well. What do you think of the vice-regal governor, Lady Staffeldt? The question was as abrupt as it was overt, but somehow all Callan could read from the man's tone was genuine curiosity, as if they were sitting in some salon, discussing political minutiae over fresh coffee. Do you have much of an opinion about the man? The question itself was alarming, but somehow the utter artlessness of the delivery made the young man seem earnest instead of pushy. Callan hesitantly put him into the mental box of budding student radicals and freethinkers. Generally harmless, but probably useless. There were some students at Ashford who prided themselves on being freethinkers, and who made a big display of asking questions about the official line. Their questions particularly focused on the propaganda masquerading as history class. While it was interesting to listen to them interrupt class to point out the poorly concealed contradictions in the textbook, Callan had no time for them. For all that the limited number of milquetoast student radicals were only asking questions, doing so out in the open could draw official attention to themselves, and to her via proximity. Attention she desperately wanted to avoid. Even more importantly, she sincerely doubted their teenage rebelliousness would ever push them over the brink from asking questions into actual activity against the imperial apparatus, making them weak allies at best and more likely active hindrances to her own activities. Still, this one actually showed up. We're not exactly at Ashford right now, are we? Prince Clovis? Callan asked aloud with a friendly smile. Well, he's quite the artist. I mean, I'm not really one for the arts and stuff, but I saw a piece of his on a class trip to the Museum of Art, and it looked pretty decent. How about you, mister? Spicer, the man stuck out his hand, and Callan gave it a brisk shake. Alan Spicer. I've seen you at lunch a few times. You usually eat in the main courtyard, right? Oh, that explains it, Callan exclaimed a tad theatrically as she let out an internal sigh of relief. I thought I knew you from somewhere, but I couldn't quite put a name to your face. Yes, I do like the courtyard, the garden is lovely, and it's nice to get some fresh air between classes. Did rivals invite you along? In a manner of speaking, Alan replied, releasing her hand. He was wandering around telling everybody about what a fun extracurricular he'd found. I was curious and didn't have anything to do tonight, so I decided to give it a try. Well, thank you for coming out to help, Callan said with a smile. There's always room for more hands. Or, the smile slipped. Well, I'd normally say that, but unfortunately it looks like this will be the last soup dinner the Benevolent Association will be serving for a while. I guess it's a good thing you didn't wait until next week to come. Really? But, why? Alan's face artfully crumpled into a frown, lines of consternation and worry radiating across his face. The expression reminded Callan of a barrister from one of the legal dramas her stepmother loved to watch in the Stadtfeld Manor's home theater. It was, she realized, an obviously practiced expression of concern. You served so many people tonight alone, Alan continued, tilting his head in a gesture that somehow conveyed a profound lack of understanding coupled with a sincere desire to learn, and as your friend mentioned earlier, the price of food is only going up. Surely there's more need now than ever before? Well, yeah, Callan acknowledged, but that's the problem. The Rising Sun Benevolent Association relies solely on donations from local businesses and philanthropic nobles, and if you hadn't noticed, the first aren't doing well at the moment and the other is in short supply. Since we help take care of the people who were affected by the event that, as you said, we can't mention, we can't exactly go to the area administration for help. That certainly is quite the pickle, Spicent nodded, and yet, are you really okay with just leaving people to fend for themselves? No, I'm not, but... Callan trailed off, trying to figure out how to convey her feelings without slipping out of the mask of Britannian nobility. I'm not happy about it in the slightest, she said, quickly throwing together a plausible lie, especially not as a noble. Someone close to me once told me that loyalty is a two-way street. All of these people swore themselves to Britannia, shaking off their old lives in the hope of something better. How can we expect them to remain loyal without helping them? But I simply don't have the resources to make an impact by myself. For a moment, Callan thought she saw something flicker in the young man's eyes, something that said it understood her. I get it, Alan commiserated, I really do. If you don't mind me saying it, it sounds like everything you're doing should be managed by the administration. I think you're doing them an enormous favor by picking up their slack. The radiant smile returned. I really respect what you're trying to do here, Lady Stadtfeld. It's very impressive. It's not exactly common to hear a noble talk about loyalty to those below us. Damn it, Callan. You did it again. You opened your mouth and let your brain fall out. Talking to a Britannian about obligations to the honoraries. Tanya would be appalled. This kind of thing is why Diathad paid attention to you to begin with. It's just common sense, Callan replied hotly, trying to defend herself. Have you ever felt like working hard and doing your best for someone who just hits you all the time? I sure haven't. The people that really make me give my best are the ones who make me feel valued and important. And the honoraries aren't stupid, and it's not like they don't remember what happened earlier. Hey, no need to worry, Alan broke in, hands raised in a pacifying gesture. I told you, I get it. Not going too deep into my own baggage, but the honoraries are far from the only people to suffer at the hands of abusive and neglectful leaders, men who should care for those who depend upon them. Oh. Callan suddenly felt foolish. She'd completely misread Alan's smile. It hadn't been mocking in the slightest. She had been so wrapped up in herself she'd missed something personal. She felt embarrassed and foolish and, once again, very Britannian. Well, good, she continued lamely, I'm glad we agree. You know, Alan said, his tone considering, I'd actually kind of wondered if you were some sort of employee of Prince Clovis when I came here tonight. He paused and hurriedly continued. I mean, I had wondered if the Viceroy was trying to get around any sort of official pushback from the purists by supporting your charity. It would have been a clever way to mitigate honorary grievances without being seen to oppose a powerful political faction. Realizing that her fists were clenched and her teeth gritted with anger, Callan forced herself to relax. That would have been a very clever idea on the prince's part, she agreed with a laugh, but I'm afraid that's not the case. We'd welcome some official backup, but, as far as I know, nobody in the Rising Sun is drawing an official salary. And if they are, Callan thought, I'm sure Naoto will deal with them just as soon as that little fact comes to light. That's a real shame, Alan commiserated, shaking his head. Honestly, I really hope the prince somehow sees what you and your people are doing. You've helped him out of a hole that, if I'm being honest, he dug for himself. Hopefully someone in the administration will see the worth of your organization and throw some of the budget from the Clove Island to project your way. Hopefully, Callan agreed, but I'm not holding my breath. Anyway, I need to get back to helping sort out the rest of the cleanup. Thank you again for coming by and helping us. I guess I'll look forward to seeing you at Ashford. I'll certainly be looking forward to our next meeting, Lady Stadtfeld. Alan smiled. Perhaps we should do lunch sometime? Anyway, until next time. Until next time, Callan said, smiling half in farewell and half in relief that the strange conversation had come to an end. It had been, she decided, a productive exchange, and she'd definitely never spoken to a Britannian in Japanese for half this long before. To her surprise, instead of a parting wave, Alan bowed to her from the waist, hands folded in front of him in a formal farewell. Instinctively, she bobbed forwards, catching herself halfway down and converting the motion into an abbreviated curtsy. Alan didn't smirk or laugh at her slip-up, instead only tilting his head before turning on his heel and vanishing into the darkened park. Alan Spicer, huh? Callan shook her head and resumed her trek back to the waiting rising sun truck. Britannian nobles with actual brains inside their heads are pretty rare. He seemed a bit too happy with the administration, but he was also sympathetic. Maybe he could be another Rivals? Man, with 3 people on board, we'd practically have a cell of our own at Ashford. The thought startled a giggle out of Callan, who promptly slapped a hand to her mouth and looked around to see if anybody had noticed the slip-up. No way. That'd just be crazy. Who the hell would think of trying to set up a radical cell in the middle of a school for the upper crust? If I floated the idea with Danya, she'd definitely think I was joking. 2 miles and 30 minutes away from the park, Alan Spicer ceased to exist once again. At least this time I'm not running from the police, Lelouch thought as he scrubbed the wig adhesive out of his hair. It's far easier to put myself back together with the aid of a mirror and sink. Less trash as well. The cheap hotel room was comfortingly anonymous. Grey-green walls, beige carpeting, and furniture that has unquestionably been purchased in bulk. Just one anonymous room in a practically endless sea of identical copies. It was absolutely common in a way that Lelouch had only rarely experienced in his life. In his youth, the ostentatious splendor of the imperial palace in the heart of Pendragon had seemed unremarkable. Familiarity with the endless masterpieces and architectural wonders had bred contempt. The Spartan Kurugi temple, at first startlingly foreign, had likewise grown mundane over time. Ashford Academy was, for all of Million Ryuban's pretensions, just a little slice of the land that would never again be home, and it carried the shadow of all the vainglorious trappings of his childhood. His life had all been a sea of luxury, a succession of palaces and estates and stately manners. All of his life, that is, except for the single 2-month period of the conquest and its immediate aftermath, before the Ashfords had arrived with the first wave of Britannian settlers. Lelouch had been far too focused on Nunnally's dwindling weight and his own shaking limbs to care about the burnt-out hovels Suzaku found for them back then. In their own way, the surroundings of those 2 months had been just as extraordinary as the palace at 5 St. Darwin Street. The door clicked behind Lelouch as he left the hotel lobby, his overnight bag slung over his shoulder and his key dropped into the night deposit box. He doubted that Stadtfeld, Callan, was going to report Alan Spicer to any kind of authority. Then again, he hadn't expected he'd have to flee from the imminent arrival of the police last time he'd stuck a toe into these waters. Better an abundance of caution than too little. Well, the she's a spy theory seems dead in the water. I was right the first time. No spy who'd work for Clovis would stoop to serving soup to honoraries. So, either she's somebody else's spy, or she just happened to try to break into my apartment right before she started hanging out with Rivals. It went against Lelouch's Pendragon-honed instincts, but coincidence seemed like the more likely option of the two. While there was certainly plenty of scheming going on in the Tokyo settlement, he couldn't for the life of him think of any other faction that would be interested in him more Nunnally, except maybe the purists. Well, maybe some minor faction would want him to be the master of ceremonies for their private celebration of the new holiday Clovis had ordained in his memory. And if the thought of one of Clovis's agents feeding honorary Britannians is unlikely, the thought of a purist agent doing the same thing is just laughable. Purists aside, nobody else would have any interest in a prince and a princess supposedly 6 years dead, especially since the prince had been disowned and the princess was a cripple. The Japanese would probably kill him, but they surely had better things to do and probably wouldn't be able to recruit a noble spy. The levelers, if they existed, wouldn't care about those the emperor had already thrown away. Maybe the Chinese or the Europeans both love to play the puppet government in exile game, although I think the Chinese would probably kill us just as readily as the Britannians. Royalty or not, they're not going to install a commoner's offspring on a throne. That would produce a bad precedent, at least in their eyes. No, Lelouch decided firmly, that Wei Li's paranoia. She's a nosy woman, far too intelligent for her own good, and she's probably up to something foolish. She's definitely connected to the Japanese somehow, she speaks the language like a native, and she's publicly associating with outright 11s, not even just honorary Britannians. Either way, that's her problem, not mine. She's not after Nunnally and me. For a moment, Lelouch felt accomplished. A minor mystery had been solved, a variable quantified. Then, his mood collapsed back down into the gutter. It was his first success in 2 weeks. 2 weeks wasted, 2 weeks without a single idea of how to move forwards. Lelouch kicked an empty beer can, sending the aluminum can skittering down the sidewalk. I need an idea, an edge. The honoraries are a possibility, they seem pretty beaten down. On the other hand, they already knelt before my father once, they might do so again. And Suzaku. Something inside Lelouch spasmed in pain at the memory of the current state of his best, and perhaps only, friend. His sudden appearance at the Rising Sun soup line had been a nasty surprise. Lelouch had been forced to blend into the crowd, head held low to obscure his features. It was unlikely that Suzaku would have recognized him, but Lelouch declined to take the risk. Suzaku. I've been wondering if you were dead or alive for 6 years. Ever since we parted in that burned-out town. I wish you had been there when Ryuban found us. But I never expected you to turn out like this, Suzaku. What happened to you over these last 6 years? His old friend had always gravitated towards authority and order. He had always seen things very clearly as right or wrong, with little patience for shades of grey. He had never shrunk from using violence to enforce and support what he saw as right. Lelouch could see all of those traits in the Suzaku who had threatened that Japanese woman with a baseball bat. What he couldn't see were the less obvious traits of the Suzaku he had known. The honest kindness that had seen Suzaku tenderly doting on Nunnally, joining in Lelouch's endless descriptions of their surroundings so his blinded sister could feel included. The endless cheer that had followed Suzaku unflaggingly when they were younger. The sense of honor, the need to protect the weak and to care for those under his authority, instilled by Instructor Todo. He had seen none of those traits in Corporal Kurorugi. Most of all, Lelouch hadn't seen the unflagging nationalism, the honest pride in his people and their culture, that the Suzaku he had known had carried as a standard. Suzaku had been the one to teach him the culture and traditions of his people, the one to explain how to wear a kimono and how to open a bottle of ramune. Suzaku had been the one to sneak Lelouch into the ceremonies conducted at the heart of Kurorugi Temple, the one who had bragged endlessly about anything Japanese. All of that was missing from the cold-eyed thug who wore his friend's skin and carried his name. Still, at the very least, he's alive, Lelouch told himself. Nunnally will be overjoyed to hear it. Unfortunately, Suzaku's reappearance hadn't sparked any inspiration. It had provided an example of how not to lead, but Lelouch hadn't needed any further examples when his father's shadow loomed so large over the entire world. Perhaps the real lesson in that experience hadn't been Suzaku's actions, but the reaction they had provoked. Lelouch had seen the way the honorary Britannians in the crowd and the 11s at the serving line had looked at his old friend, and how they had looked at Stadtfeld. He was certain that any attempt by the soldiers to harm her would have led to Suzaku and his men being torn limb from limb. That's loyalty, the exiled prince thought as he continued down his solitary way. The streets were empty this late on a Monday night. A loyalty purchased by shared experience and mutual commitment. How had Stadtfeld bought it? Were some soup and commiseration truly enough? The king must lead, or else the pawns won't follow. But how does one find the pawns to lead? Even Suzaku found some pawns, at least 4 of them, an analytical corner of his brain pointed out, apparently by suborning the bonds created by an existing organization. Combined with his personal authority and the formal power granted by his rank, that was enough to create a cell willing to follow him into danger despite his lack of leadership skills. Surely I could do better. But what organization could I join to follow that pattern? The army would require far too much documentation, not to mention a full-time commitment, which would effectively end my life at Ashford and separate me from Nunnally. Lelouch shook his head. The army was a closed door to him for a multitude of reasons. But surely there are alternatives. Mile upon mile of street and sidewalk disappeared under Lelouch's wandering feet. The hour was late and only getting later, and he was no longer entirely sure where in the Tokyo settlement he was. Somewhere northwest of the concession, which lurked as a dark mound suspended on its vast supports over the nighttime horizon. He was in a Britannian working-class neighborhood, one much like the neighborhood south of the Ginza Maglev station, the one where his first attempt at rabble-rousing had fizzled. I wonder how the old men at the deli and Mrs. Fisk are doing, Lelouch thought, idling at a street corner. They were already treading water weeks ago, and prices, as always, had gone up since then. Pedestrian concerns. Damn, what a fool I was to just dismiss all of their worries like that. I was so busy scanning for talking points that I forgot to listen to what they were saying. A glint of silver reflecting from the grimy bricks of the alley across the street caught Lelouch's attention. For lack of anything better to do, Lelouch crossed the street to see what had caught some errant beam of light. He would have to turn his feet back towards Ashford Academy soon, or at least towards the nearest maglev station, but something of the spirit of the night had taken hold of him, leaving him in a fey mood. At first glance, the graffiti emblazoned across the stained bricks looked very similar to similar amateur paint jobs Lelouch had seen pretty much any time he ventured outside of Ashford Academy or the boundaries of the concession. A broad silver line slashed across the wall was bisected by another similar line, and both were surrounded by a vaguely triangular shape. Something about it twigged Lelouch's attention and he leaned in closer, peering through the dark into the stinking alley. If you squint at it, the triangle's sides bow out towards the middle before tapering down into the point. Almost like a shield, or a coat of arms. Suddenly interested, Lelouch pulled out his phone and thumbed on the light. In the white glare, he could see that the symbol had a smaller symbol in the upper left quarter of the pseudo-shield, daubed on the wall in black paint. The paint had smeared and dribbled, but he could just barely make out what looked like a P over an X. P and X? He frowned, trying to puzzle out the hidden meaning. Perhaps the initials of the graffiti artist, or those of his sweetheart? Or, maybe not a P and an X, but maybe the older Greek characters they came from. Rho and Chi. Lelouch's eyes widened slightly as a long-ago lesson in state dogma flashed through his mind. No, the other way around. Chi and Rho. The squint deepened into a frown. The Britannic Church isn't popular, and I don't think I've met any Britannian who I'd call devout in my life. Almost nobody is anymore. In the age of Darwin, it's passé. So, why would someone in a working-class neighborhood feel the need to paint an ancient and obscure Christ-Hane symbol on a wall, in a coat of arms? As he mulled this fresh puzzle over, Lelouch scanned the rest of the wall with his phone light. Near the base of the wall, half hidden behind a dumpster, he saw a powder blue line pointing further down the alley. Walking around to the other side of the dumpster, he saw a vague looping pattern, followed by another X, or maybe a Chi and an 8. The looping pattern looks like something in motion, Lelouch thought, bludgeoning his brain as he tried to remember the theology classes he'd been subject to so long ago. At the time, he'd considered them easily the most useless of his entire education, even less applicable than formal rhetoric or table etiquette. Maybe a fish? That's important, I think. And an X and an 8 would be 18? What the hell am I doing? Lelouch suddenly wondered, wandering through alleys in the middle of the night. Nunnally's probably worried sick. The thought of his sister broke through the peculiar fever that had infected Lelouch's mind. That's right, Nunnally expected me home hours ago. Sayoko probably put her to bed already, but she has trouble getting to sleep if I'm not there to say good night. And besides, I'm not going to figure out this mystery tonight. Even if I did, what would I do with the solution? This will keep, and if it won't, there's no real loss. Content with his evening's explorations, Lelouch turned his weary feet towards the maglev station at long last. As he slumped down onto his seat aboard the train, he couldn't help but smile with anticipation. After days of intellectual starvation, he had finally found something to take his mind off his past failure and current listlessness. I just hope that the news about Suzaku is enough to defer the scolding Nunnally's probably got simmering.